Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a statement by Alex Neil on the Waiting Times Audit Report. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. Cabinet Secretary, 10 minutes.
Much indeed, Presiding Officer. This statement relates to the internal audits the Scottish Government requested health boards to undertake following PricewaterhouseCoopers' external review of NHS Lothian's waiting times. As members will recall, the report detailed practices that were completely unacceptable. Since 2007, when this government took power, we have abolished hidden waiting lists, which had a total of 30,000 patients on them, slashed waiting times for routine operations to no more than 12 weeks, now as a legal right, and delivered a referral to treatment journey of no more than 18 weeks for 90% of patients. Presiding Officer, it is within that context that I now wish to advise the Chamber on the results of the 15 audits into waiting times practices. This is the largest investigation into the management practices of waiting times ever carried out in NHS Scotland. Every single episode relating to every patient on a waiting list between January and June this year was analysed by specialists to identify specific trends or patterns which required further investigation. This involved around 2.5 million transactions for the 6-month period investigated by the internal auditors. Earlier this afternoon, all boards published their internal audits on their websites, and this meets our commitment to ensure all the reports would be in the public domain. These reports will now be scrutinised at public board meetings in the new year. I will now set out the findings of the internal audits. Firstly, the reports provide no evidence of dishonest or wide-scale manipulation of waiting times across the NHS in Scotland. Secondly, overall, the waiting times published by boards are reliable and accurate. Thirdly, the principal shortcomings relate mostly to the capability of recording on some IT systems, consistent interpretation of guidance and staff training. And finally, there are also specific localised issues in board areas which need to be addressed. The reports identify a number of areas for improvement in the management of waiting times. Some of the improvements have already been implemented. We have already replaced social unavailability with patient-advised unavailability as of the 1st of October, whereas previously boards themselves could interpret the patient's unavailability. It is now up to patients to agree to a period of unavailability. This should ensure that the service is tailored to patients and give them control with regard to their availability for appointments and treatment. Secondly, as of August 2012, we have tightened the monitoring and recording of waiting times, with the reasons for unavailability having to be recorded as part of the treatment time guarantee. And thirdly, the implementation of the legal 12-week treatment time guarantee came into effect on the 1st of October 2012. So if a patient wishes to go to a specific location or goes on holiday, then the patient, having requested the unavailability, must receive a letter from the Health Board confirming the patient's request and explaining any impact on their treatment time guarantee. This ensures complete transparency between patients and the health service. I am pleased to report that a number of the other audit proposals have already or will be implemented by the end of this month, and I expect boards to have implemented all proposals by the 31st of March 2013. Any extension beyond this date will require my officials and myself to approve it, and will only relate to external factors, for example, where there are system developments required. But as the audit reports show, more needs still to be done to improve the consistency of recording and quality of waiting times information. I am therefore implementing an action plan on waiting times, relating firstly to recording, systems, procedures and training, and secondly to reporting and governance. On recording and systems, 70% of the auditor's recommendations relate to this category. Unavailability provides very positive flexibility for patients in most instances. However, it should never be used without the patient's knowledge to avoid a breach of targets, as was the case in Lothian. This was one of the principal reasons we asked for the national audit into all NHS boards' practices. We needed to know if there was any other evidence of deliberate manipulation. The key recommendations in respect of recording and systems from the reports are: 1. Review of the recording of the reasons for the use of unavailability codes; 2. Recording of details of offers of appointments made by telephone in local systems; 3. Review and monitoring of user access; 4. Strengthening of systems controls; and 5. Implementation of standard operating procedures consistent with national guidance and supported by adequately trained staff. In relation to reporting and governance, the main recommendations are: 1. Improvements in reporting of waiting times information to provide greater clarity; 2. Clarity of governance arrangements and escalation processes; and 3. Review of team structures in some boards in relation to waiting times, teams and management. All of these recommendations will be implemented in full. Presiding Officer, I want to refer in some detail to 3 boards in particular. First of all, Glasgow, as it was quoted yesterday in the Parliament. Let me read the key quote from the Glasgow report. Our sample testing did not identify any evidence of inappropriate amendments or contraventions of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde's waiting times policy. On Tayside, in relation to the 2 members of staff suspended, I can confirm that NHS Tayside have issued a statement today which says, on the matter of the media reports surrounding the suspension of 2 members of staff, we can confirm that following a full investigation, those precautionary suspensions, which were non-disciplinary acts from the outset, were lifted on the 19th of December and the members of staff have returned to work. Our investigation found there was no evidence of any deliberate instructions being given to any member of staff regarding the inappropriate use of waiting times codes in the sample which was looked at in the audit. And an update on Lothian: since the Lothian report, substantial progress has been achieved in both reducing the backlog and the lack of unavailability. NHS Lothian has a number of recommendations from its internal audit, which I expect to be fully implemented on time. Presiding Officer, in addition, as part of my action plan, accountable officers, the chief executives, will of course be held personally responsible for maintaining sound systems of internal control in relation to waiting times. I expect a letter of assurance from the chair of every board's audit committee to be sent to the Scottish Government Health and Wellbeing Audit and Risk Committee by the end of April 2013, providing assurance that all their action plans have been completed. I am also insisting that boards undertake a follow-up audit on the management of waiting times within the next 18 months to ensure that the planned improvements have been made and are working effectively. I would also like to remind the Parliament that Audit Scotland are currently undertaking a separate investigation into waiting times across the health service in Scotland. I look forward to receiving that report and will take appropriate action as a result of any recommendations that makes. Whilst all waiting times guidance has been updated and issued to take account of the treatment time guarantee, we will further review our guidance and make any required amendments in the light of the publication of the 15 audit reports. With thousands of staff, hundreds of locations and millions of transactions, this is an area of massive complexity. In taking forward the action plan, I want to ensure we adopt a philosophy which pursues service excellence. Indeed, the Scottish Inpatient Survey published this year indicated that 88% of patients were happy with their waiting time. I want to ensure that level of satisfaction is maintained and improved upon. To help me manage and monitor the Waiting Times Action Plan, I am setting up a parallel stream of work to ensure consistency, quality and robustness in waiting time reporting and management. The Professor of Six Sigma and Process Excellence at Strathclyde University, Professor Zizou Anthony, will also provide additional strategic-level oversight as part of this work, with regular reporting to me. Our staff are acting with integrity and in the best interests of patients. It is our 155,000 staff working together that we owe a debt of gratitude for reducing our waiting times to the current all-time low. However, as these audits have shown, boards need to give their staff a system which is easy to work with, where the rules are clearly understood and which are transparent to patients and their carers. That is why the audit recommendations will be followed up and fully implemented swiftly. I will hold the chief executives and the chairs of boards to account for that timetable and challenge them to show the necessary leadership in pursuit of better services for our patients. Thank you.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. Be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak button now. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of his statement, but regret that its contents demonstrate beyond any doubt that the SNP waiting time scandal has just deepened. His statement is a whitewash, full of assertions that are patently not true, which would be evidence if you had bothered to read the internal audit reports. And for apparently, Presiding Officer, no problems, there's an awful lot of action now happening. First, there was NHS Lothian, caught fiddling the waiting time figures. At the time, Nicola Sturgeon assured this chamber that she had spoken to all health boards and this was only a problem in Lothian. Then came NHS Tayside. Evidence revealed today of blatant waiting times manipulation, serious allegations of bullying and pressure being applied to staff. And the problem is wider. Other health boards have retrospectively adjusted their figures. Social unavailability is at an all-time high of almost 21,000 at June 2011, now dropped to 9,500 as of September 2012. Now, that is nothing short of a miracle. The one thing that is clear is that the manipulation of waiting times is rife. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, auditors have been unable to interrogate data, no audit trail, and where they sampled 60% of patients had their waiting time guarantee suspended. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me why the internal audits cover the period from January to June 2012, when Audit Scotland is looking at April to December 2011? Is that health boards being given time to cover up after NHS Lothian was exposed? Can the Cabinet Secretary now confirm that Nicola Sturgeon misled Parliament when she said it was only a problem in Lothian? And isn't it the case, Presiding Officer, that today the SNP has shown that instead of leading the NHS, they are misleading Scotland and the thousands of patients who have been affected by this scandal?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have never heard such an hysterical and outrageous attack on the National Health Service in Scotland. And if Jackie Bailey thinks that it's becoming to launch that kind of unfounded attack, then she is not fit to be the spokesperson, never mind a minister. Let me remind you what Jackie Bailey said on the 27th of September in the Glasgow Herald. This is astonishing and shows the scandal of waiting time fiddling in Lothian wasn't a one-off. Presiding Officer, PricewaterhouseCoopers and all the other auditors have shown that it was a one-off. And will she not have the grace to admit that her scaremongering was totally unfounded and her allegations are totally without foundation? And I think the attack we've just heard effectively on NHS staff is totally outrageous. And her representation of the position in Tayside is wholly inaccurate and misleading. And let me just say a word or two about Glasgow. And this is the overall statement from PricewaterhouseCoopers about Glasgow and Greater Clyde. And what it says is, on the basis of the work performed, we found that overall the waiting times, processes and procedures within Glasgow and Greater Glasgow and Clyde were operating in a controlled manner with no material deficiencies identified. In addition, I'm reading the report right now. In addition, our sample testing did not identify any evidence of inappropriate amendments or contraventions of their waiting times policy. That is the conclusion of the independent auditor. And no, it doesn't fit the script that obviously Jackie Bailey wrote before she read the reports, because nothing she said is reflected in these reports.
Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank the Cabinet Secretary of early sight of his statement. This scandal began because, as we accepted at the time, the Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, was serially misled by Lothian Health Board at the time. The allegation thereafter that there was a widespread systemic collapse across Scotland was the reason this investigation was undertaken, and I think patients across Scotland will actually be relieved to find that the suggestion that that is the case is not borne out by the detailed investigation that's taken place. However, and I'd like to return to a point the Cabinet Secretary made yesterday about the responsibility of NHS boards, because I think insofar as the various reports have a common theme, it is that it is possible that some people believe that appointments to NHS boards are something of a sinecure and not a fundamental responsibility. And the inconsistency the Cabinet Secretary refers to at the end of his statement, where rules are not clearly understood, are transparent with patients and their carers, is the responsibility I would like the Cabinet Secretary to give me an assurance he will rigorously enforce with NHS boards. Many of the actions that have been recommended ought to have been actions which the boards themselves ensured had been in place without the necessity for this detailed review to have taken place. And in that sense, I think there is a wake-up call that I hope the Cabinet Secretary will act upon.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I thank Jackson Carlaw for a very objective and fair comment on these reports. Clearly, Jackson Carlaw has read the reports, unlike Jackie Bailey. Can I accept what Jackson Carlaw says? It is the responsibility of the boards to manage waiting times in the same way as it is the responsibility to manage all aspects of the running of their board. But they must be held to account, particularly through the chairs and the non-executive directors. And that is why, starting with Ayrshire on Monday, as part of the annual review process, I have instituted a particular and separate meeting with the non-executive directors in each board to encourage them to question, to probe, to play their role, as they would at any company, in terms of ensuring that the executive is held to account within the board. And also, I've encouraged the non-executive directors not just to take the information they get as read, but themselves to check by going to the front line, talking to staff, and finding out what's actually going on in their board area. And having been a very successful businessman, I'm absolutely sure Jackson Carlaw will understand the importance both of the critical role that non-executive directors must play on any board, and secondly, the importance of being aware and knowledgeable about what happens in the front line.
We have a number of people who want to ask questions on this important subject. Can I please ask you to confine your question to a question? And can I ask Cabinet Secretary to be as brief as it's possible, to be Aileen MacLeod, followed by Richard Simpson?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement this afternoon. Now, given the Chief Executive of the NHS recently said that our health service has had its best ever performance this year, does the Cabinet Secretary share my conviction that our hard-working doctors, nurses and administrators will be more than up to the task of implementing the recommendations of these audits?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say I totally agree with the sentiment expressed by Aileen MacLeod, and in fact I can confirm, Presiding Officer, that I have announced today to the staff of the entire health service, as a gesture of goodwill and as a measure of thanks in difficult times, I have agreed that the National Health Service will pay the fee of £59 for the disclosure arrangements, so-called the PVG, which all staff are required to register for disclosure. And I think that gesture, going to every member of staff in the National Health Service covered by PVG, is a clear indication, not just from the government, but I hope from the entire Parliament. It is a gesture at this time of year to thank all our staff for their tremendous efforts in the National Health Service.
Richard Simpson, followed by Bob
Presiding
Doris.
officer, as a previous consultant, I had my PVG paid by the board, so I think that last statement, whilst welcome, is actually irrelevant, nothing to do with what we're discussing. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to re-examine these audits? Because firstly, will he acknowledge that the detailed scrutiny was not of every record, but of a sample, and the audit trail was flawed in many boards? Secondly, why did he order the review for January to June 2012 when the Lothian scandal was exposed in the late summer of 2011? And it's very clear that the board's practices began to change.
I think you need to bring your remarks to a close, Cabinet Secretary.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just say two things? To start now questioning the professionalism of the auditors was beyond belief. You know, if you don't like the message, shoot the messenger, is a message from the Labour Party. The fact of life is, in every case, these independent auditors of world-class standing have said there is no fiddling. The only people left in Scotland who believe there's any fiddling outside Lothian is Jackie Bailey and Richard Simpson.
Bob Doris, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Presiding officer, I welcome that there was no material evidence of manipulation or abuse of waiting times policies in Glasgow. However, there was concerns over how information was recorded on IT systems. Can I ask what action has been taken in Glasgow to improve such IT systems to make sure that my constituents can get the best and most reliable service possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say that when we took over in 2007, there were 11 different IT systems operating in Glasgow. By the end of next year, there will be one IT system operating in terms of managing waiting times. That's the difference between ourselves and the previous administration. They ran a shambles which ended up in waiting times of 6 months. We are putting this into order. That's why we've got record low waiting times for our patients in Scotland.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Roderick Campbell.
Will the Cabinet Secretary accept the systemic underfunding at the heart of this scandal in Lothian and the significant improvements that are still required? And will he now admit that his £10 million loan needs to be direct funding for new staff and for clinical facilities to tackle the waiting times backlog?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Sarah Boyack's slightly behind the times because they've recruited new staff. They've announced they've recruited new staff. They've got the money, according to the Chief Executive, required to sort the problem. And if I may say so, in terms of our question earlier to the First Minister, the real reason there has been a short-term problem for a couple of days in relation to beds in Lothian, the underlying reason is because Edinburgh Royal Infirmary is under capacity, was designed under capacity to the tune of 20%. There are 20% less beds than are needed because they got it wrong and messed it up. They're to blame, not us.
Roderick Campbell, followed by Jim Hume.
Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the audit into NHS 5 identified no inappropriate behaviour or pressure on staff to hide breaches or manipulate data within NHS 5, although recognising areas for improvement in practice. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this indication of hard work in NHS 5 is in comparison to the discredited hidden waiting list of the previous administration?
In the interest of brevity, Presiding Officer, and to let more backbenchers in, let me totally agree with that statement.
Jim Hume, followed by Mark MacDonald.
The Cabinet Secretary read out a statement from NHS Teesside absolving themselves of wrongdoing, but chose to ignore the audit, which spoke of, and I quote from the audit, bullying, inappropriate behaviour, possible breaches of NHS Teesside's regulations. And there was evidence that...
Can we get the question, Mr Hume?
And there's, yes, evidence that 17% of cases experienced a systematic application of unavailability to prevent a waiting time breach. Does he agree with me that the patients of NHS Teesside deserve better, and can he advise what personal contact he now plans to have with NHS Teesside officials to address this unacceptable performance?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think the member has to make a distinction between allegations and what's actually been found to be true or not true. As far as any bullying is concerned, I've made it absolutely clear, and I repeat, our policy is very clear. It is one of absolute zero tolerance towards bullying of any member of staff, and I've made it abundantly clear to chairs and chief executives, if any member of staff is found guilty of bullying another member of staff in the National Health Service, I expect appropriate disciplinary action to be taken. To try to blame that on the SNP government and ministers is total absurdity. It's an operational matter for the boards.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you very much, President Officer. On December 3rd, Jackie Bailey said the suspension of 2 NHS Tayside employees was the beginning of a national scandal of health boards fiddling waiting times, and claimed she was owed an apology from these benches. As the 2 staff members have been fully investigated and reinstated this week, and the reports today demonstrate Ms Bailey's claims to be false, would the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the only apology owed is the one from Jackie Bailey to the hard-working staff of our NHS?
Cabinet Secretary.
I totally agree, Presiding Officer. If Jackie Bailey had any grace at all, she would now apologise and retract for her unwarranted and unfounded allegations in relation to Tayside and, indeed, the wider National Health Service in Scotland.
Drew Smith, followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary refers to the board report, so let me quote briefly from the Glasgow report. Often little or no detail is recorded in the waiting time system due to systems limitations in the character fields, and there is therefore little or no evidence to support the contact being made with the patient, content of the conversation and the offers being made in the spirit of New Ways guidance. As such, there is no way of formally verifying the validity of any subsequent application of unavailability without contacting or asking patients. Yesterday at Health Questions, he was asked for a guarantee that there has been no fiddling of the figures in my city and that of the previous Cabinet Secretary. Based on this report, can or will he give that guarantee today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I will read the conclusion resulting from that part of the report. Whilst our testing of the process within Glasgow South did identify a number of issues and areas for improvement, the testing did not identify any evidence of inappropriate amendments or contraventions of waiting times policy. You know, Presiding Officer, the Labour Party remind me of a Victorian undertaker looking for a hard winter and a full churchyard.
Jim Eadie, followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that when failings are identified within the health service, as they clearly were in NHS Lothian, swift and decisive action is essential in order to restore trust and public confidence? And isn't the lesson of today that the failings identified in Lothian are not typical of the wider management culture within our National Health Service?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely, Presiding Officer. Clearly the reports do show major areas for improvement, as I have said. But there's a big difference between saying there are areas for improvement and saying there's dishonesty or deliberate manipulation and fiddling going on. Every report, every single report undertaken by these independent, world-renowned auditors make it absolutely clear outside Lothian there is no fiddling in the National Health Service in Scotland.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I may refer to what the Cabinet Secretary said in relation to the hospital beds provision in Edinburgh in particular. It was obvious that the Royal Infirmary was too small, but what plans are there to increase the number of beds in Lothian?
Cabinet Secretary, this is about waiting times.
I'm happy to answer.
Can you make it very brief?
One sentence. We've already reopened the Royal Victoria to take account of the necessary capacity requirement.
That ends the statement from the Cabinet Secretary. We now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5203 in the name of Kenny Gibson on the Finance Committee's report on the draft budget 2013-14. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Kenneth Gibson to speak to move the motion on behalf of the Finance Committee. Mr Gibson, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to open this Finance Committee debate on the Committee's consideration of and report on the Scottish Government's draft 2013-14 budget. Can I thank my fellow committee members and clerking staff, past and present, for their contribution throughout the process, and our budget advisor, Professor David Bell, for his customary informed input. We agree our focus would be on whether Scottish Government spending decisions align with this overarching purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth, building on last year's work and scrutiny of the Scottish Spending Review 2011 and Draft Budget 2012-13, in which the Scottish Government stated, "Decisions taken within this budget have been shaped by the Scottish Government's purpose of creating a more successful country, with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increasing sustainable economic growth, our budget supports job creation. As part of a wider investigation on increasing sustainable economic growth, the committee held evidence sessions on improving the employability of individuals furthest from the jobs market. The committee recently published a separate report on improving employability to be debated on 8th of January. In our budget scrutiny, we asked stakeholders to what extent they consider Scottish Government spending decisions that align with its stated purpose, and how should this objective be reflected in the draft budget. Also, given the Scottish Government's strategy of bringing about long-term structural change, what spending decisions support such change and what spending priorities should be in the budget? Full details are available on our webpage, and I thank those who gave written and oral evidence. I now focus on key aspects of the report, starting with the context of next year's budget. The committee notes an overall cash reduction of 0.6% and real terms reduction of 3% in the DEL Treasury allocation. However, the Cabinet Secretary stated in a letter to committee that he was able to carry money forward from the previous and current years to the next, and that by extracting best value from our capital programme, indeed.
Gavin Brown.
Does the member still think there is a DEL cash terms reduction after the autumn statement?
Kenneth Gibson.
I don't really think that's really relevant, given the fact that I'm actually speaking on as to the report which we compiled and which was published before that autumn statement, as you know. So I don't really think whether I do or not really is of any relevance to that. But if you go on, I will mention some more figures. And of course, we're all aware that over the piece we have an 11% reduction in resource and 26% reduction in capital. Where was I? Indeed. The Cabinet Secretary stated in a letter to committee he was unable to carry money forward from previous and current years, and that by extracting best value from our capital programme, we're able to plan to spend within the parameters of the budget exchange mechanism on a slightly different profile from that originally allocated to us by the Treasury for 2013-14. Accordingly, as the draft report states, the budget now shows a 1% cash increase, but real terms reduction of 1.5%. Our report highlights the ongoing economic uncertainty faced by European and the UK economies since the financial crisis. This is put into context by the Scottish Building Federation, which during a roundtable discussion referred to a £5.7 billion net reduction in capital budget between 2009-2010 and 2014-15. I'm sure Gavin Brown will accept that the announcement in the autumn statement has not mitigated against that. Concerns that work is not progressing quickly enough is also of concern, and the need to get procurement moving. The committee invited the SFT to give evidence on this and other matters next month, but I'm sure the Chamber would welcome a response today from the Cabinet Secretary about expediting the process of awarding and implementing public sector construction contracts. As the SBF puts it, we need to get jobs at the coalface and the shovel in the ground. On procurement, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce said in respect of capital it needs to be coupled with measures to ensure that as much of it as possible is spent here in Scotland on Scottish businesses. The Government is currently consulting on procurement legislation, which we hope will increase the chances of achieving that result. We hope we can keep within Scotland as much as possible the £9 billion procurement spend that exists in the public sector in Scotland to deliver the maximum benefit to Scottish businesses in the short term and to create the infrastructure we all need in the longer term. The SBF believes that the Scottish construction industry has a record second to none in training apprentices, and the Cabinet Secretary may wish to touch on creating apprenticeships, employment and training opportunities in construction, a subject we will discuss further during the employability debate. There is strong support within the business community for the Scottish Government's emphasis on capital investment, and this is welcomed by the committee. However, there is a need for greater clarity, both in terms of the exact additional investment provided and the capital projects being supported. In our session with the David Hume Institute, Professor Donald McRae said, "Capital spend in Scotland is low compared to what it has been. I realise the Scottish Government is constrained by its total budget, but my argument is that we should look to increase those capital spending totals in each of the next 3 or 4 years." And Professor Jeremy Peat added, "It was the right decision to transfer money from departmental expenditure limit resources to DEL capital." However, he went on to say at the Spice draft budget briefing, "Could not find out whether the money is being transferred, how it is being transferred, where it is coming from or where it is going to. It is critical that all of us, and particularly the committee, have consistent data so that we can monitor the changes during the financial year and between financial years in such a way that we know what is happening." As a consequence, the Cabinet Secretary is aware that the committee seeks greater detail about the planned health resource to health capital budget and the resource to capital switch within the enterprise agency budgets, although he did touch on some of this at our Hoyt session. We also seek greater clarity in future draft budget documents about such switches. The Scottish Property Federation drew attention to the importance of generating consumer confidence. The committee highlights that Registers of Scotland recorded just under £1.8 billion in commercial property sales, compared with a high of £6.3 billion in 2006-07. The Cabinet Secretary in his draft budget statement on 20 September stated that the focus of capital investment was on transport, housing, digital and maintenance projects. And I'd like to discuss two of these areas, digital infrastructure and housing. The McLaren review of ICT infrastructure identified savings over the 5 years from 2012-13 of over £1 billion through improved tendering, procurement and sharing of ICT resources across the public sector. In the debate last year, I said, the committee asked for an annual progress report on savings that have been achieved, with an explanation when savings have not been achieved. Potential savings are significant. This is money that can be reinvested in projects to support growth and create jobs. The committee again asked the Scottish Government for an annual update on the progress being made. Broadband provision came up at a number of evidence sessions, for example, Professor Kay and their workshops in Hawick. Professor Kay posed the question, is public support for expansion of broadband access an effective use of public money? And he said, the cost of providing widespread, very fast broadband is high, but the business benefits are not clear or substantial. Bluntly, much of the benefit of very fast broadband is about the rapid download of movies. That is a really data-intensive thing that consumers use. To my mind, that definitely falls into the nice-to-have category. At our Hawick workshops, people were keen to make the case that the priority in rural borders, and no doubt in other rural parts of Scotland, is for people to first get reliable access to the internet at an acceptable speed. Concerns were expressed by the Scottish Chambers of Commerce about progress in rolling out broadband in the Highlands and Islands. When asked whether it wanted expenditure focused on giving Scotland a long-term competitive economic advantage rather than shorter-term capital projects, the response was, yes, we want to use this opportunity to create the kind of Scotland in which businesses find it easier to compete, connect and do business. By delivering capital projects, particularly in transport and digital technology, we can move towards achievement of those goals. The Rural Affairs Committee believes that rolling out digital connectivity to all rural communities and businesses is crucial to achieving sustainable economic growth. We asked the Scottish Government to provide more detail on the prioritisation of internet access across Scotland as compared to prioritisation of high-speed broadband. The Scottish Building Federation wants greater capital investment and capital projects to get moving. One way of doing so is through housing. Sustaining capital investment represents extremely good value for the public purse, since every pound invested in construction can generate as much as £5 of benefits to the wider economy. Conversely, a failure to sustain investment in this area is likely to have a significant impact on the wider economy. It believes changing demographics and rising population are exacerbating an already chronic housing shortage and making the need for new homes even more acute. This point was also made to committee as part of our ongoing demographic change and ageing population inquiry. The Scottish Federation of Housing Associations raised the preventive spend aspects of housing. Unplanned hospital admission costs the NHS £1.5 billion a year, and the SFHA stated, if people have a home to which they can return, they do not stay in hospital as long. In fact, they do not need to be kept in hospital because the adaptations budget should allow for adaptations to be made to their home. The Cabinet Secretary may wish to comment about the adaptations budget for next year. Our report highlights the ICI Committee focus on affordable housing and its recommendations in relation to that budget. The Finance Committee believes that consideration is given to additional funding for affordable housing should that become available, and indeed I'm sure we all welcome the additional £50 million announced yesterday. There was frustration about the access to early-stage risk capital. Ian Ritchie of the Royal Society of Edinburgh said, basically, companies must find risk capital. They must sell some equity in the company in order to fund the development base before they can build their businesses. Risk capital is potentially a big problem here in Scotland. It is great that angel funding is very strong in Scotland, but there are some problems with the next stage. The next level of risk capital is almost impossible to achieve. Without risk capital, we will not have companies and we will not have an economic future, so we need to solve the problem of how to get substantial risk capital. Well, out with our budget scrutiny, this issue was discussed last May with Philip Grant of Lloyds Banking Group, Professor Jim MacDonald of the University of Strathclyde and Dr Lena Wilson of Scottish Enterprise. Philip Grant made the point that the networks and frameworks are there and there's private equity and support. Scotland also has great professional advisory base that is available to companies to support them. The critical issue is working more closely together. And the point was also made that companies reach a point at which significant capital is required. One option that is available at that time is to seek capital by in effect moving the business into another model through being acquired. Access to funding is of pivotal importance in supporting and encouraging business growth and maximising company opportunities. In the budget debate last year, I referred to concerns raised as to whether the government's £500 million change fund was new money for new projects or substitute money for existing projects. The committee sought more detail about the make-up of this funding and whether change to facilitate prevention is spent that way or diverted to other services. The committee last year said it was essential change funds are effectively monitored. The Scottish Government responded that monitoring process were being developed and put in place for each of the three funds, and that it would provide an update on progress in this draft budget. There is some narrative but little detailed assessment, and as the report states, no detail regarding how much was allocated to change funds and the preventative services these support. Monitoring the need for leadership and the importance of gathering sound data were recurring themes over the last 18 months. We look forward to a positive response from the Cabinet Secretary on change fund monitoring and evaluation arrangements. Greater detail is required in terms of allocations to NHS boards and local authorities, what additional funding has been made available, and how any shortfall in the £500 million arising from local authorities will be considered. The committee would welcome initial comments on this and early provision of information. Presiding Officer, the committee is clear in concluding that the emphasis on capital investment is welcome, but recognises the need for greater clarity both in terms of additional investment provided and capital projects supported, although some of that was provided yesterday. There is also a need for greater analysis of linkage between spending priorities and outcomes, including a cost-benefit analysis of the contribution spending priorities make to sustainable growth. On that and on all other aspects of the report, we look forward to the Cabinet Secretary's report. I have covered many issues in the time available, and indeed, of course, could go into much more detail, which I am sure will be covered by colleagues of all parties over the next couple of hours. And I could also detail more of the evidence presented. However, I conclude by moving the motion in my name. Thank you.
I now call on John Swinney, Mr. Cabinet Secretary. You've got 10 minutes.
President Officer, may I begin by thanking Kenneth Gibson for setting the context for today's debate and for his opening remarks on behalf of the Finance Committee. Can I also thank the committee for the considered way in which they have approached this year's budget process and for the evidence that has been taken in this respect. Today's debate is an important part of the budget process as we look ahead to the introduction of the budget bill. The Government will carefully consider the detail of the committee's report and will respond formally in January in the normal way. More generally, I look forward to working with Parliament in the new year to build support for the Government's spending plans and reiterate the invitation that I have already made to other political parties and members to meet with me to discuss any issues they have in relation to the budget bill. The detail of the Government's response to the committee will be published in January and will set out some of the responses to the points of detail that Mr Gibson has referred to in his remarks and which the committee has made in the initial report. As I announced to Parliament yesterday, the Government will set out on the face of the budget bill that is introduced to Parliament in January its proposals for allocating some £160 million in capital consequentials generated by the autumn budget statement, which are in addition to the plans already set out in the draft budget. In doing so, my aim is to ensure that Parliament has the maximum opportunity to consider the Government's proposals ahead of the final stage of the budget bill in February. President Officer, it may help this debate if I first of all advise Parliament about the approach the Government is taking to setting out its draft budget for 2013-14 before I respond to some of the issues the committee has raised in its report. As members are aware, the draft budget has been published at a time of significant pressure on the public finances and continuing challenges in the economy, both globally and within Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Taking into account the budgetary impact of the Chancellor's autumn statement by 2014-15, we can now expect the Scottish Government's resource budget to fall by around 7.7% in real terms compared to 2010-11, the last year before the current spending review period, and our capital budget will fall by close to 26%. Looking forward, the Chancellor has indicated that the additional cuts he is making in 2013-14 and 2014-15 to resource budgets will be baselined for future years, and that the increases that he is making to capital budgets in these years will not be baselined. So, as a consequence of the autumn statement, there is a further tightening of the baseline financial position of the Scottish Government, both in terms of resource and in terms of capital. He has also confirmed that his planned fiscal consolidation will be extended by another year into 2017-18, signalling a prolonged period of austerity that will have potentially damaging implications for our economy, our services and ultimately our citizens. And he has done so in the face of the evidence that suggests his policy of austerity is not working, with downward forecasts in growth and a requirement to borrow an additional £100 billion more over the period 2013-14 to 2016-17 than was forecast in March. The Scottish Government believes an alternative approach is required, and we have welcomed the fact that the Chancellor has in part listened to that message and increased public sector capital investment in the short term. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Draft Budget published in September provides detailed spending plans for 2013-14, maintaining the course set out in last year's Scottish Spending Review. As we indicated then, capital investment is central to our plans. We are supporting our capital programme by taking forward the £2.5 billion NPD pipeline of infrastructure projects, by using innovative funding mechanisms to lever in additional resources, and we are switching over £700 million from resource budgets to support capital investment over the spending review period. Of course.
On the question of NPD funding, is the Cabinet Secretary, this was announced in November 2010, is the Cabinet Secretary disappointed at the rate of progress with NPD in the 2 years since it was announced?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I'm not disappointed with the progress of NPD, because currently, today, we have £900 million worth of NPD projects in procurement. £900 million in procurement. These projects, for example, I was at the Inverness Campus Forum that I chaired just a few weeks ago. The Inverness College procurement is expected to conclude very shortly, and as a consequence of that procurement, there will be construction activity on the Inverness College site as part of the Beechwood campus, which will start as soon as the procurement process is completed. Now, clearly, I faced a difficult decision when the United Kingdom Government substantively reduced capital expenditure in 2010. I faced a choice of cancelling a whole range of projects, or alternatively, transferring a number of those projects to revenue finance mechanisms such as NPD. Now, I thought, on balance, the best decision to take was to convert them to NPD projects. But we have to face the reality, and the First Minister touched on this point at lunchtime today in question time, that NPD projects take longer to deliver than traditional capital investment projects. And anybody that tries to suggest anything differently is not confronting the reality of some of those circumstances, which is why the decision to reduce capital investment by the United Kingdom Government was such a totally and utterly reckless decision. And on that basis, I'll give way to the other half of the coalition.
But he knew how difficult it was with the NBT model when he announced it back in 2010. So why does he now think that what he said back in 2010 was wrong? Is that what you're saying?
What I said in 2010 was my best estimate and assessment of the amount of time it would have taken. I could have taken the other approach. I could have taken the Tory and the Liberal approach, and I could have cancelled all the projects, just like they did in England. I could have done that, and that would have, I'm sure, would have gained a great deal of warm reception from Messrs Brown and Rennie into the bargain. So I really do think before anybody over here starts to have a go at me about capital expenditure, they should think about what the reckless government has done in the United Kingdom Government. Now, of course, the Government has taken steps, Presiding Officer, to boost capital investment wherever the opportunities have arisen. I announced in the draft budget a further £40 million investment in affordable housing. We have also, the draft budget confirms an additional £30 million in energy efficiency measures. And of course, as Mr Gibson mentioned a moment ago, I announced yesterday an additional £50 million for affordable housing. So, as a consequence of 4 announcements that I've made in the course of this calendar year, there has been an additional £200 million allocated to the housing sector, which I think is a substantial indication of the Government's commitment to the whole process of capital investment. Yesterday, we also set out a range of projects to utilise the capital resources that have become available to us. and coupled to the measures that we are taking as a government to protect the NHS budget, to freeze the council tax, to deliver the most generous package of business rates reliefs in the United Kingdom, to ensure that our employees have a Scottish living wage where they are covered by our pay policy. We have tried to establish in our budget a balance between the necessity of protecting household incomes and supporting incomes at such a difficult time of financial pressure, and also delivering the focus on the economy, which lies at the heart of the government's actions in every respect. And I believe firmly that the government's budget is focused on growth and will assert that position during the budget process, as is evidenced by the announcements that we made yesterday. In turning to the... of course,
James Kelly.
The Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. On the point of releasing money into the budget, I was interested in the committee report pinpointing the McClellan review and the point from the 2011 spending review that would release between £250 million and £300 million a year of savings into future budgets. Can you indicate if any of that money has been released into the current budget or the budget we're discussing?
If Mr Kelly casts his mind back to the spending review, what I indicated in setting out the approach that we expected public bodies and government agencies and government departments to take was an implicit part of their management of their financial resources, which in a number of cases were constrained financial resources. They had to use some of the techniques that were set out by the McClellan report to deliver greater efficiency, to deliver savings, and clearly I expect public bodies to be operating in that context in terms of taking forward their plans. In the time available to me, Presiding Officer, can I address a couple of other points in the committee's report? There is a significant focus and welcome focus in the committee's report on preventative expenditure. This is part of the government's general approach on public service reform, acknowledging and understanding that if we intervene early in some of the crisis situations in our society, whether it is about individuals on course to either offend or re-offend, or whether it's about the welfare of some of the youngest citizens in our society, our children in their early years, or some of our more fragile elderly individuals, we will be able to provide better outcomes and better support to these individuals while saving the public purse money if we intervene early. And I will be happy to report to the committee in more detail about the issues in connection with preventative expenditure. The focus on public service reform is implicit. The Minister for Local Government at my side here has been presiding over the review of community planning, which, in consultation with our local authority partners, the purpose of which is to ensure that, consistent with what I just said to Mr Kelly, public bodies are cooperating together and working together to deliver better outcomes as part of our public service reform agenda, which is an implicit part of our acceptance of the recommendations of the Christie Commission. The final point I would make, Presiding Officer, is in relation to the committee's attention that's been given to the issue of welfare reform. The Government has considered information available so far in relation to the implications of welfare reform, which I think all members will be aware of. I think from their caseload is becoming an ever more significant factor in our society. We are addressing that in a number of the interventions that we are making about the social fund and about council tax reduction arrangements that are in place. But clearly the Government acknowledges that we must monitor the effect of welfare reform, recognising that there is no way an administration with the constrained responsibilities and resources that we have can make good all of the damage that has been done by welfare reform. As I made clear in my other remarks, Presiding Officer, I welcome the committee's report, which the Government will consider in detail ahead of our response in the new year. I am happy to endorse the motion for debate that has been put forward by Mr Gibson. The Scottish Government has published a budget which I believe provides decisive support to our economy and public services through enhanced by the further capital investment that I have announced this week. It is a budget which is addressing the realities and the difficulties facing the Scottish economy and the citizens of our country today, and I encourage Parliament to support the committee's report and the Government's budget.
I now call on Ken McIntosh. Mr McIntosh, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And for yesterday's statement on the budget consequentials, the Cabinet Secretary cast himself in the role of Santa Claus, dishing out goodies from his sack. Now, it may simply have been too much festive cheer, but in preparing for today's debate, I began to see Mr Swinney in a different light, a man haunted by spirits of budgets past and of budgets yet to come. Yes, Ebenezer Swinney, the man who in his budget of Christmas past claimed to provide us with a budget for jobs and growth, but which delivered unemployment and recession. A man who now claims in his budget of Christmas present that more of the same, cuts to public services, colleges and housing, will somehow alleviate the hardship faced by thousands of households around the country. And of course a man whose only promise for the budgets of Christmas future is an illusory land of milk and honey, only a referendum's vote away. Not so much a vision as a cruel mirage, and one which is already fading under even the most cursory scrutiny. Of course, as I have pointed out in nearly every debate over the last year, Scotland is not the only country in economic difficulty, but that does not let the Finance Secretary off the hook entirely. He still has choices. Hard choices, yes, but his choices nonetheless. Because both last year and this, it was the Cabinet Secretary who promised a budget for jobs and growth. His words, not mine, and on both criteria, he has singularly failed. On jobs, we have heard the SNP crowing yet again this month that Scottish unemployment is below the UK average. But for the previous 3 months, it was above the UK average. In other words, over the piece, it is the UK average. The SNP have made no impact on joblessness in Scotland whatsoever. And on economic growth, we have a Finance Minister constantly praised by the First Minister, at least, for his competence, but who has been in post while Scotland has gone into recession not once, but twice. Mr Mason.
John Mason.
Mr McIntosh for giving way. I just wonder if he could explain if he thinks that Mr Swinney could have done something differently that would have helped the jobs situation.
Ken McIntosh.
But my next line in the speech, Presiding Officer, is it's not all our fault I can hear the SNP protesting, and Mr Mason takes the words out of my mouth. I am simply measuring the SNP against your own criteria, jobs and growth. It's your words, not mine. In the Dickensian tale, Presiding Officer, Bob Cratchit and his son, Tiny Tim, are both struggling to make ends meet because Scrooge won't pay Cratchit a decent wage. There are eerie similarities in our budget of Christmas present. These are budgets which simply pass on Tory cuts. In some cases, the SNP make them even worse, as in housing. If you look at the evidence to the ICI committee during this budget, Shelter, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the Scottish Building Federation, all have pointed out the impact of SNP's cuts to the housing budget. That's not a Westminster decision, that's an SNP decision, and the effect has been to devastate the construction industry in Scotland. The SNP think that they've been clever by reducing the housing assistance grants from 70,000 to 40,000. But all that's happening now is that housing associations are unable to borrow on that level of funding to build social housing, so the SNP, of course, just recalculate and describe mid-market rents as affordable housing. One area where there is no doubt who controls all the levers of power and all the public spending in Scotland is education. It's one area where we know the Scottish Government can make a real difference, investing in skills, in training, in the knowledge economy. Yet what do we find? Huge cuts to college budgets, resulting in a vast drop in the number of learners, number of people attending college, with a particular impact on adult returners. Or take plans to improve our rail system. The Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme cut in half. That money should be reinstated now, so that we can actually get Scotland working again. And may I add, when the contracts are awarded for these programmes, we should have a proper procurement process in place so that apprentices are taken on, so that there are local jobs, so that local small businesses benefit, and we don't simply send the contracts to China, as is the SNP's want, for the cheapest and unsustainable practices. Mr Gibson.
Josh, a few weeks ago you criticised the Scottish Government for planning to transfer £250 million from resource to capital. Now you're calling for, you said it would cost 8,333 jobs. I wonder if you now retract that statement. And if you also believe that we should spend more money on the Glasgow to Edinburgh rail route, where should this capital funding come from?
I have no idea what the first part of Mr Gibson's remarks come from, but refer to certainly the second part. It should come from the real asset base. I don't understand why the government have done this whatsoever, and they should restore these cuts right away. Presiding Officer, there was a particularly revealing quote in John Swinney's evidence to the Equal Opportunities Committee. And I quote, "My strategy was based on the assumption that by 2010-11 the private sector would be recovering, and therefore the consolidation of public sector finances could be done reasonably. I have freely and openly conceded," this is Mr Swinney talking, that that assessment and that assumption were wrong. I do not think I was wrong to make that assumption, but my assumption and my prediction were wrong. Some apology. My policy hasn't worked, but I wasn't wrong. But actually, the real revelation is that John Swinney has put all his eggs in George Osborne's basket, swallowing the notion that somehow cutting the public sector allows the private sector to fill the gap. That's where the real crime has been committed here. John Swinney has cut and cut and cut, and the effect has been devastating on the Scottish economy. Mr. Secretary.
Mr McIntosh perhaps participated in parliamentary committees. He might see the context in which comments have been made. And what I was saying to the Equal Opportunities Committee is that in 2008, when there was a Labour government in power and threatening consolidation of public finances, I brought forward capital investment to ensure that we created employment in Scotland. And if Mr McIntosh cares to look at the labour market statistics, he will show that that was entirely successful. What I did not predict was the massacre of public finances by that crowd, which destroyed capital investment and led to an increase in unemployment. So perhaps if Mr McIntosh, who apparently vaguely believes in the same approach to economics as I do, would perhaps reconsider his remarks in that light.
Well, interesting. I think it's Mr Swinney who vaguely believes in Labour's approach to economics and copies it, and has copied it deliberately over the last 10 years, trying to reinvent themselves as a party of the social democratic left. But clearly this is where they're tested. And I would draw Mr Swinney's attention to a very interesting blog published by Dave Watson from Unison this week, which points out exactly why he's made mistakes and where he's wrong. Dave Watson points out that a staggering 51,700 jobs have been lost in the Scottish public sector over the last 4 years.
Mr McIntosh.
Tens of thousands, thank you, Presiding Officer, tens of thousands of Scots put out of work as a direct result of Mr Swinney's decisions, matched, I may add, by another 50,000 in the private sector. And, Presiding Officer, I could not agree more with his conclusion that this action really tells the tale of the Scottish Government's priorities.
I now call on Gavin Brown. Mr Brown, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin, I think, by looking at the overall size of the Scottish budget, as I alluded to in an intervention to Mr Gibson, because the Scottish Government made great play in the budget statement that the DEL budget next financial year was going down in cash terms. It was emphasised and re-emphasised, followed up in a letter from Mr Swinney to the Finance Committee to make it very clear in their view that the budget was going down in cash terms. However, as a consequence of the autumn statement 2 short weeks ago, the budget in cash terms for DEL next year is increasing. There is a paper, in a moment, there is a paper at the back of the chamber, Deputy Presiding Officer, from Spice, saying that for 12-13 it's 28.608 billion. Next year, for 13-14, it's 28.615 billion. A small increase, Presiding Officer, I admit, but an increase of £7.2 billion to the Scottish Government. That is some cut. Mr Brodie, I did say I would take Mr Brodie Cabinet. Well, I'll take the Cabinet Secretary first.
Cabinet Secretary. Can I save Mr Brown from himself? He just told Parliament it was an increase of £7.2 billion. I suggest he changes the record.
Gavin Brown.
I'm very happy to correct the record in that case. If the word billion slipped out, it certainly didn't intend to. But let me. I'm happy to. The point when I make mistakes, I'm very happy to correct them, Deputy Presiding Officer. £7.2 million. Yes, I said I would take Mr.
Brodie.
I thank G. Brown Mark II for taking the intervention. While he talks about the increase in cash terms, does he not accept that in real terms the funds available to the Scottish Government has gone down by 0.4%?
Gavin Brown.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think in every debate I've acknowledged that it's going down in real terms, but going up in cash terms. But let me move on to the comments that I mentioned to Mr Swinney about capital investment, because Mr Swinney claims to take no lessons from anyone on capital investment, because he and only he and the Scottish Government have got that right. Let me point out first of all to the Scottish Government that it is the total budget they are given that counts most. It is within Mr Swinney's gift to switch money from revenue to capital if he so desires, and if that's what the Scottish Government's political priority actually is. Let's look at the NPD model, though, which has raised its head a number of times in the past couple of weeks. We were given the impression in this chamber back in September that not only was all going well with the NPD model, not only were we on track with everything that we'd planned to do, we are accelerating. We are bringing forward capital spending for schools under the NPD model. That was a narrative the Scottish Government sought to weave, but how it has unravelled over the last couple of weeks. The Scottish Government said that in 2011-12 there would be up to £150 million spent under the NPD model, and in reality there was £0 spent in that financial year. We were told that in the current financial year there would be £353 million spent on the NPD model. We were told in evidence just a month ago by the Cabinet Secretary that £20 million would be spent on the NPD model. That is not the fault of councils, that is not the fault of the UK Government present, that is not the fault of the UK Government past, that is entirely down to the Scottish Government's political priorities and not pushing the NPD model. And just for good measure, next year initially it was going to be £774 million, but it's actually going to be about half of that at £338 million. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, it is about time the SNP Government took a share of the responsibility for the position that the construction sector finds itself in. Kenneth Gibson quoted the Scottish Building Federation. They also said, though, in their evidence, to suggest that this budget, or any budget at this time, could be a budget for growth in the construction sector is out of touch with the reality. And while they acknowledged the reductions in capital spending from the UK Government, they described in Scotland a constipated procurement system. That is not the fault of the UK Government, that is entirely the fault of the Scottish Government, who haven't got capital projects moving. And even yesterday, when we were told how the £205 million or so were going to be spent, the Scottish Government were unable to tell us exactly when these projects were going to happen, other than at some time in the financial year 2013-14. That is not good enough, Deputy Presiding Officer, when we have seen the sloth-like performance of the NPD model under this Government. The construction sector deserves far better. The Scottish Government yesterday couldn't even tell us which of their shovel-ready projects didn't have planning permission, but at First Minister's questions today, the First Minister boldly asserted the shovels are in the ground. On Wednesday, they couldn't tell us which ones had planning permission. On Thursday, they could tell us that the shovels were in the ground. That's why this is not a budget for the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very tight for time in this debate. Speeches of 6 minutes and interventions must be contained within that. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Reviewing the given draft budget, we must ask if this plan will increase sustainable economic growth, and I believe it will. Goals are necessary considerations. Money allocation can be a simple mathematical process, one that perhaps even could be assigned to a computer. We know that the budget has a certain tightened amount of money to work with, but with a constant number of areas that require funding. Unless we take Professor Kay's recommendation and just pick winning areas, and that's not in alignment with the Government's approach. And in relation to what Professor Kay said on broadband simply being for people getting films over the internet, I would say, Professor Kay, look at my constituents and other rural areas where increasingly you have to interact on the internet or not at all. Registering your VAT returns is an internet-only option. I have constituents who have a round trip of over 20 miles to register their VAT. Not terribly helpful to business. However, it's our goals that take us away from the cold, complicated computations and instead allows us to aim higher. President John F. Kennedy said, man is still the most extraordinary computer of all. And it is man and the deliberations of men and women that make the difference. The Scottish Government has said the priorities of the budget are to accelerate economic recovery, continue the shift towards preventative approaches to public service delivery, and maintain commitments to the social wage for Scotland, not something that is accepted in some other parts of this chamber. These are all crucial and viable goals from which the people of Scotland will only benefit. And the drafting, reviewing and debating process is an excellent time to ensure that these goals will be best met in the final budget. It's a time to debunk the idea that hacking off parts of the social wage will build support for anything other than further decline economically, socially and on every other way. So let's continue to keep our goals for growth and sustainability in mind when we look closer at the Scottish Government's draft budget. With £40 million for affordable housing, £18 million for skills training, £80 million for schools for the future. And these are investments in housing, training and schooling, investments in our future. I will.
Gavin Brown.
Sorry, the 80 million that he refers to for schools for the future, is that for next year's budget?
Stuart Stevenson.
You've read the budget as I have. You can see the number as I do. That 80 million for schools for the future is a very important part of creating the infrastructure that we need so that we have a trained, effective population that is going to be able to seize the opportunities in future. And I think that's the important thing. The whole point is the investment plans are going directly to the people of Scotland suffering from the 2008 downward spiral, with which we're now grappling all the way to 2018. Aims to expand the availability of housing and schooling, creating new jobs each year. Housing, skills, schools, the resources for recovery. The man who's lost his sock at the end of the bed because he's getting another for Christmas. Ken McIntosh.
Ken McIntosh.
Thank you for taking the intervention, Mr Stevenson. I think I'm trying to follow that metaphor. I'm pleased that Mr Stevenson says that the government should be measured by whether it achieves economic growth, but the government also claims to this is a budget for jobs. So does Mr Stevenson think that the government should be measured by whether or not unemployment goes up or down, either as a stand-alone measure or simply by comparison with the rest of the UK?
Stuart Stevenson.
The member may be somewhat unwise to open up the rest of the UK, since across the piece we are doing a bit better. And that is without having the powers that would enable us to balance taxation with expenditure in the way that a normal country would. Had we the full powers, then there would be a full range of levers that could be used economically to further address beyond the success that we've already have. We are investing in jobs in construction, skills and the green economy. That's in addition to the Green Investment Package with £30 million for fuel poverty, energy efficiency, low-carbon transport and plans for the fossil fuel levy surplus to be used to establish the Renewable Energy Investment Fund. All steps in a right direction, bringing us closer to our climate change targets, green jobs, a green economy, certainly meeting our goals of growth in addition to sustainability, and more to come. Last year, 95% of the £2 million transport budget was invested back into the private sector, supporting 12,000 jobs. Now let's plan to invest another 180 over 2 years into construction skills and the green economy. In my own constituency, £18 million will establish an Energy Skills Academy, proudly taken forward by Banff and Buchan College. The economy is clearly going through a hard time, but not as hard a time as Ken McIntosh seems to be going through. His sock's going to be empty unless he buys Accounting for Dummies. That's what he really needs. Presiding Officer.
Can I remind members to address the remarks through the Chair, please, not directly to each other. I call Elaine Murray to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yet again, I have the opportunity to speak in the last debate before Christmas on the Finance Committee report and the draft budget. I've actually left the committee to join the Investment and Infrastructure Committee, so I'd like to thank my former colleagues on the Finance Committee, the clerks and the Budget Advisor for putting up with me for the last year. Some of us on the Finance Committee felt that we should make comment on whether or not John Swinney had actually succeeded in the ambitions that he announced when he introduced his draft budget, that it would be a budget for economic growth and one which would boost construction. Now, three of us, looking at the evidence, felt we could not see the evidence of that. Three others on the committee thought it was an absolutely wonderful budget. One member of the committee disagreed with both camps, and therefore there was no published judgment on the budget. But I would like to say a little bit about why I think the evidence isn't there. We spent a lot of time in the last year in the Finance Committee taking evidence on preventative spend, and as I said in my speech last year, and it is a point often made by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, socially rented housing surely qualifies as preventative spend, as homelessness, temporary and poor quality housing affect the health and well-being, educational achievement and ability to sustain employment of those who live in them. And construction, as I think we all agree, is also a fast and effective way of stimulating economic growth. It is disappointing, therefore, that the housing budget continues to be squeezed more tightly than capital spending as a whole. The Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee noted that affordable housing spending was being cut by 45% over the spending review period, while I'm going on to what you're going to say, I think, while capital spend is reducing by a third. Now, we had an announcement yesterday of an additional £50 million for affordable housing next year, and of course that is welcome, of course it is. However, it is still the case that the total housing supply budget, including yesterday's announcement, is £269 million and £46 million less than the revised housing supply budget for this year. And while the Scottish Government continues to trumpet their figures for the completion of socially rented housing, much of that was funded under the previous, more generous terms and the period of accelerated spend. Figures I obtained from the Housing Minister in answer to a recent parliamentary question demonstrate a significant fall in the number of housing starts over the past 2 years, from 7,677 in 2009-10 to 3,025 in 2011-12, less than 40% of the figure 2 years earlier. And that coincides with the funding available to housing associations for new build being cut by 47% over exactly the same period. Shelter stated in their evidence to the ICI Committee that we are heading for a cliff edge with regard to new completions in the next few years. Now, the ICI Committee also noted, briefly.
Kenneth Gibson.
Is it not the case that when Labour were in power, they spent £562 million and completed 4,832 houses, affordable houses? But under Mr Swinney in 2011-12, 2,050 houses in addition to that figure were completed for much less public money. Does that not show that the Scottish Government are delivering affordable houses much more effectively and efficiently?
I don't know where Mr Gibson gets his figures for. Actually, the Labour-led executive has built over 38,000 homes for social rent between 2000 and 2007, and that's on the basis of Scottish Government figures, so I just don't recognise what Mr Gibson is saying there. But I'd like to also refer to another answer I received to another parliamentary question on the funding being provided to housing associations for the construction of new homes for social rent across all local authority areas between 2009-10 and 2011-12. While the overall funding claimed had reduced by 53% over those 2 years, some local authority areas showed much more significant reductions. Housing associations in Aberdeenshire, for example, claimed only 1.4% of the sum that they had claimed 2 years earlier. And in several areas, housing associations had received only 10% of what they had done in 2009-10. So although I heard the answer given yesterday to my colleague Richard Baker, I would sincerely request that the Cabinet Secretary gives serious reconsideration to the suggestion from the ICI Committee and the SFHA that the Scottish Government should review the grant level. Now, it stands to reason, too, that as the population ages, the need for adaptations to enable older people to live healthily and independently in their own homes will increase. I therefore share Age Scotland's disappointment that the budget line for sporting transitions has been reduced. Beald Hanover and Trust Social Reform and Investment report states that adaptations save Scotland's health and social care sector over £10,000 for each adaptation. And they
Last
estimate that their investment of £1.4 million has already saved the Scottish Government £5.3 million. And that surely is a good example of preventative spend, as well as improving the quality of life for older people. Can I also make reference to the suggestion that we should have information in the budget on in-year revisions, and have those presented in addition to the agreed budget of the previous year? Now, I know that that wasn't done by previous governments, but perhaps all governments were wrong. I would argue that it is more important to fully understand the funding picture of previous years in times of austerity. We need to do that. And if you want committees or opposition spokespeople to suggest transfers of funding to and from budget lines, we actually need that information. Now, I just would like to complete by commending the Finance Committee's report for the draft budget for highlighting a number of quite difficult issues, and I very much hope that the Cabinet Secretary will take those into account when he produces his draft budget bill next year.
Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I rise to speak as another former member of the Finance Committee. Indeed, I think I'm right in saying that only the convener and deputy convener remain from the original members at the start of this session, and I can assure them it's nothing personal. But, Presiding Officer, we do indeed face two tough financial times here in Scotland. We have already heard from the convener of the Finance Committee of the 11% fall in revenue and 26% fall in capital that this Parliament and this Government will receive as a result of the austerity measures being pursued at Westminster. And it makes it all the more interesting that we are somehow supposed to dance with joy at the crumbs that occasionally fall from the table at Westminster. Yes, undoubtedly it is welcome that there is additional capital investment coming to Scotland, but that doesn't disguise the fact that the UK Government remains committed to a wrong-headed austerity approach. Indeed, don't just take the word of the Scottish Government for that. We have Nobel laureates like Krugman and Stiglitz who are out there saying that the clear priority should be to focus on economic growth. Instead, the Chancellor decides not to try and grow his way out of a recession, he tries to cut his way out of a recession, and that is clearly demonstrated to be the wrong approach to be taking, not just for the economy, but also for the most vulnerable in society. And this is a budget that is about priorities, because when you are operating within a shrinking resource, when you are operating within tough financial times, you do have to make decisions around what your priorities are as a government, as a parliament, as a nation. And this government has made it very clear where its priorities lie. It looks to protect frontline health spending. Indeed, the protection of frontline health spending was unanimously backed in the Health Committee report, signed off by all members of the Health Committee as being the right thing to do, to target the Barnett consequentials to the territorial health boards, because that is the best way to ensure that frontline health spending is protected in these difficult times. Investment in the living wage, not just in maintaining but also in uplifting the living wage, and also the announcement that this year the pay freeze for public sector workers will end. Yes, it is a modest increase, but it is an increase nonetheless. And continued investment from the Scottish Government in the universal benefits, which I believe benefit, firstly, those most vulnerable in society, but most importantly, they benefit wider society as well, and benefit all of Scotland. And we should recognise that it was interesting that Mr Macintosh went on his Christmas Carol-related theme, because, as we all now know, if it were up to the Labour Party, Tiny Tim would be paying for his prescriptions. But also, it is about capital expenditure and the use and deployment of capital expenditure to deliver economic growth, Presiding Officer. And that is a key element of what the Scottish Government is trying to do, not just in terms of the capital investment that is coming forward as a result of said crumbs falling from the Westminster table, but also in terms of the shift of resource to capital in order to try and boost employment, in order to try and grow the economy within the limited powers that we have available to us. And also a priority for this government is the preventative spend agenda, the shift of significant sums of money to try and ensure that instead of dealing with the problem at the end of the process and tackling the problems that arise, we get down to the root causes of those problems, the societal issues that need to be dealt with through developing things like, for example, family nurse partnerships, to ensure that those in the most hard-to-reach areas get the support that they require, to ensure that those problems that arise later don't arise in the future. That requires a significant shift of funding, which this government is providing, but crucially it also requires a significant change in mindset within the public sector. And we all, as parliamentarians, must do what we can to ensure that that mindset change occurs. And that's where I have a difficulty with the doom-mongering approach that Mr Macintosh so often brings to this chamber, because we always hear from the Labour Party that they want more money spent on this and more money spent on that. But the politics of tough times requires a degree of honesty from those who wish to argue for additional spending. No, Mr Kelly is not going to stand up and invent more spin doctors that don't exist and claim that somehow...
Mr Kelly, the intervention is not being taken.
That means no thank you, and I was speaking in plain English, Mr Kelly. It doesn't behove the opposition to stand up here and call for more spending here and more spending there without the consequential admission of where funding would have to be removed from in order to pay for that. And I know it's a difficult balancing act for Mr Macintosh to carry out. I've said no once, and I'll say it again.
Mr Kelly, the member's in his last minute.
For Mr Macintosh to carry out, because he's got all of his spokespeople saying that they want more funding for the areas which they are responsible for. But he should at least have the humility and the decency to come to this chamber, and when he argues for funding increases, argue also where he would take that money from in order to pay for that. And finally, Presiding Officer, I make no apologies, and this party makes no apologies for making it clear, I'm in my final minute, Mr Macintosh, this party makes no apologies for making clear that it would be much easier for us to shape and control the future and the destiny of Scotland were we to have the powers here available to do it, were we to have the powers to shape a taxation system, to shape a welfare system to ensure that there is a safety net for the most vulnerable in society, and to ensure that we could deploy borrowing powers to the betterment of our economy, rather than sitting around hoping for some sort of charitable handout from a distant and disinterested Westminster government.
I now call Willie Rennie to be followed by Chip Brodie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Just following on from Mark MacDonald, if independence was to deliver so much success and recovery and jobs and prosperity, you just wonder why they're waiting for 2 years. But I presume they've come up with the answer for that before. In this party, we've worked constructively on the budget. Last year we voted for the budget, and I can indicate to the Finance Secretary that we will be seeking to work constructively again this year. It doesn't mean we don't have concerns. We do have concerns about the budget, and I will outline some of them as I'm going forward, but we will act constructively as we've done before. We will act responsibly. We'll identify funds that, if we want to spend extra money, we'll identify where the money should come from. So we will be responsible in our approach to it. There was one aspect that I did agree with Mark MacDonald about spend to save, investment in early education, early intervention. I think that is something we should accelerate, which in some ways is why I was so disappointed with the First Minister's response at First Minister's questions today to my request for 2-year-olds to get early education. 40% in England, I can remind people, and also only 1% in Scotland are predicted to get that kind of support for the 2-year-olds. Professor James Heckman has set out numerous times the value, the fact that if you invest £1 now in a 2-year-old, you'll get returns of £11 later. You know, the evidence is there, it's overwhelming. I understand Professor Heckman's coming again to visit ministers. Perhaps that's something that the ministers could tell him, that they are going to invest in 2-year-olds when he does visit. The Finance Secretary said early in his earlier contribution, he said that anybody who said that NPD was not a complicated and difficult process should be criticised. But I presume when in 2010 that he set out his budget, he knew all these things, that it was going to be difficult, that it was going to be complicated. And I don't doubt that it is complicated. But I'm just puzzled why at that time he boasted about the amount of money that he was going to spend through this complicated, difficult NPD process. Because nothing really substantial has changed since then. He knew that it was a Conservative Liberal Democrat government at that time. So he knew what the landscape was going to look like. Yet he ploughed ahead and predicted, but now he's having to make significant reductions. And this year, as Gavin Brown says, from £353 million down to £20 million. So I'm not quite sure what's changed in that time. Perhaps the Finance Secretary, in his summing up, could set that out. There also, I think, the committee's report, I have to say to Kenny Gibson, is a very good report. It's pretty thorough. It looks through on some of the detail in terms of identifying where the capital, extra capital from revenue has actually come from, because there doesn't seem to be very much clarity about which revenue areas have suffered, and I think the committee is right to identify that. Also, on the Change Fund, exactly what the benefit has been from this extra investment in the Change Fund, because some, including SCVO, who I'm not used to quoting, I have to say, they have highlighted concern about where that money is going and where it's come from. And I think the committee is right to identify we need greater monitoring and evaluation, because if we are going to convince the sceptics that early intervention is worthwhile, we need to have the evidence to prove that. There also needs to be an explanation as to why the Early Years Fund seems to have been cut by £14 million. There doesn't seem to be an explanation from the government on that, and perhaps, again, the Finance Secretary could set that out. The committee also, I think, rightly requests information on whether the Christie Commission's recommendations on the kind of duty to consider preventative measures in budget is something that they should progress with. And I would welcome, again, a response from the Finance Secretary whether that is going to be progressed, whether there's going to be a duty on local authorities to consider these matters. NUS are running their almost annual campaign to secure a reversal of the £35 million cut this year in the FE College's funding, and I think that would be something that's worthy of support. We've campaigned with them in the past and will be campaigning with them again, and we hope the Finance Secretary listens. On Aberdeen City Council, I asked the Finance Secretary before about the floor that they had set in previous years of 85% of the Scottish average, and he reassured me that that was going to be met, but nothing seems to be forthcoming about how they're going to meet the £25 million shortfall. The floor, the level just now for Aberdeen City Council seems to be 78%, which is well short of the 85%, hence the £25 million shortfall. We welcomed yesterday the extra money for social housing, and I think that is very welcome, but I want to be reassured that that is going for genuinely affordable housing. That there is concern in the sector about where that money is going to be targeted at.
30 seconds left.
I was also very pleased to see the money for a project up in Forres for Atos. I was very surprised the backbenchers on the SNP benches didn't criticise that for going for Atos, but I congratulate the Finance Secretary for identifying some project that will be very good for that part of the country. Considering backbenchers' criticism of Atos in the past, I was surprised they weren't more vocal. At that point, I will conclude my remarks. Deputy Presiding Officer, thank you.
I now call Chick Brodie to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's debate, and I think the tone of this debate on a good Finance Committee report is important. We're all aware of the current stress in families, in our communities and in the country caused by the economic straits that we're in. And I think to exacerbate that by exercising some sort of visceral, even cosmetic tribalism, it serves no purpose at all. I think we should leave the "oh yes we can, oh no you can't" to another place. Let us clearly and cogently discuss this report and debate our spending priorities. And while I know that our priorities are clearly different from the opposition's, I say in all honesty to the opposition that it is incumbent, as Mark MacDonald said, on the opposition to spell out its alternative budget plans and how it would address the issues in this report. If it aspires to reduce or increase costs or revenue elements of this budget or change recommendations to the report, then I believe it is necessary to tell this chamber, indeed the electors, exactly what it alternatively would increase or reduce, and let these decisions be judged in terms of employment impact, investment returns and long-term sustainable economic growth. To assist in that, Presiding Officer, I agree with the recommendation in sections 203 and 204 of the Finance Committee report in that there should be some technical changes to the presentation and the formatting of future budgets. We need clarity and consistency of terminology, just as we need a bridging analysis from one year to another, comparing the proposed budget lines, each of them, to those of the previous year's budget and to its likely outturn, with appropriate statements aligned to major itemised changes. That will lend itself to more discussion, I believe, around principles and policies, rather than batting sometimes confusing numbers all over the place. Presiding Officer, I support this paper and the Cabinet Secretary over this budget and, in general, the report, not blindly, but because I have to compare its purpose and objective with that of the UK, which, until the UK Government's autumn statement conversion, had no plan to balance investment in jobs and accelerate its opportunity to pay down its massive deficit and borrowing. I also do so, Presiding Officer, for other reasons. Let me give you 3 examples. I received 2 weeks ago a letter from an outgoing college principal who declaimed quite clearly that her colleagues and she was particularly anxious to embrace the plans that we have for colleges and saw an exciting future for the colleges in Scotland. We don't often hear that in this chamber. On Monday, I attended the meeting of the National Health Service Ayrshire and Arran Review Board, where the head of nursing, when asked the question about shortage of nurses, said there are no shortage of nurses, and that she was operating within budget. And in another circumstance, we had a council that had an underspend of £3.8 million in last year. Now, although there may be some doubt of competency over the latter, there is little question that even recognising the seriousness and the short-term implications that we face, the people of Scotland have accepted and do accept the need for innovation, change and efficiency, as is reflected in this report. And importantly, and recently, in a particular YouGov poll, over 60% of Scots agreed, 24% disagreed, but over 60% agreed that we should be able to invest money in short-term on capital projects so that we pay down that very deficit more quickly than does the austerity regime adopted by the UK Government. In more specific terms, Presiding Officer, in these straitened times, the establishment and maintenance of business confidence, particularly in the SME and third sectors, is critical to our medium and long-term sustainable economic growth. And while the budget welcomes, and I welcome, the budget maintaining the spend in cash terms, the Finance Committee's invitation to the Government to respond to issues around access to risk capital and seed funding is particularly welcome. These sectors are the engines of future growth. They need to secure their future and do so through, I'm almost finished, through financial and business support. Financial business support is indeed critical. So I welcome the Finance Committee's report and its constructive questions and recommendations. Difficulties mastered are opportunities won. And I'm sure that all of us, in our approach to this and approach to the nation's financial well-being will be, hopefully, constructive.
James Kelly, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I do welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate on the Finance Committee report on the draft budget. It is one of the traditions of the parliamentary year that as we move towards the Christmas season, the Parliament always debates the Finance Committee's report, and quite a number of the participants have spoken the debate over the years. I also want to thank the Finance Committee for the report. I think it's a very useful contribution to the process and to the debate. And I also think that it highlights some of the flaws in the Government's approach. I think there are 4 particular areas that the report brings out that underline the weakness and the lack of robustness in the Government's approach to this budget. First of all, it brings out that there's been a lack of a link to outcomes. Page 5 of the report, the committee asks queries whether there's any proper cost-benefit analysis and whether any economic modelling exists. on the on linking of spending priorities to economic growth. Page 6 notes the contribution from the Financial Scrutiny Unit when they note that the draft budget doesn't include in each portfolio section an explanation of how that portfolio budget contributes to national outcomes. On page 7, the Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee says that the Scottish Government has been unable to provide systematic evidence linking funding options back to outcomes. On the lack of a link to economic growth, which is obviously very important, bearing in mind that the recent Bank of Scotland statistics show that GDP has fallen in the last 3 quarters. There's a lack of an impact assessment around resource to capital switches and how that would contribute to sustainable economic growth. The Local Government Committee identifies that there's an absence of clearly identifiable, meaningful and measurable outcomes to assess the effect of regeneration as regards to sustainable economic growth. There is also a lack of detail. The Finance Committee itself, comments on the revised estimates on NPD and why that wasn't provided in the draft budget, and we've had some debate on that this afternoon. The change funds that people have spoken about, little detailed assessment made in implementation of change funds. Also, the £500 million figure, it's unclear how that's been arrived at. Furthermore, there's been a real lack of transparency that's brought out. The Infrastructure Committee says it's difficult for them to assess how to allocate money in terms of active travel because of the lack of transparency in the budget. The Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee said that little progress had been made in developing methodologies that would allow the Scottish Government to understand the full downstream impact of individual policies on climate change targets. And finally, the Education and Culture Committee say that it's a feature of this year's budget that several witnesses have been unable to identify movements and changes from previous years, and that was something that Elaine Murray spoke about. Yes, I will indeed.
Mike Mackenzie.
You just said finally there, which leads me to believe that that's the end of your list. Would you accept that not one of that long list that you've mentioned represents a criticism of the budget itself?
James Kelly.
That brings me on to my next point. I think when you've got 4 areas where the process is flawed, it contributes to sloppy policy making and therefore gives you a weak budget. And that comes against a backdrop of there are less houses being built now since 1926, and that's in the budget document. We saw earlier in the week the impact throughout Scotland of the areas. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. The areas in our community suffering from deprivation. And last week's Audit Scotland report highlighted how health inequalities are still a big issue. It strikes me that the SNP's attitude to a shrinking budget, something that's going to keep telling us going to shrink over not just in the coming years, but all the way to 2026. The SNP's approach to this debate is to look away now. They're not prepared to embrace the debate and face up to the issues. Again, if you look at the Christie report, your own committee, Mr Gibson, asked for information on how the government were taking forward the Christie report. Still nothing has come forward. And also on the McClelland review, despite what the Cabinet Secretary says, there's no detail as to how identified potential savings are being released into the government. So there's a lot. In summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, the process shows that it's a flawed process from this SNP government, and they must revisit some of these areas as we enter the further stages and the budget progresses through the Parliament.
Thank you. Remind members there is no extra time in this debate. Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I rise to speak as a relatively new member of the Finance Committee, not the newest. Malcolm Chisholm has taken that mantle from me. I wasn't on the committee for all of the evidence gathering for this report, but can I thank colleagues for the work they've done and indeed the other committees for the work they undertook in assessing the budget. Can I commend the Finance Committee's report? I think it is, as Chick Brodie said, a good report. I want to speak to a number of parts of that report and also about the Scottish Government budget more generally. Before, though, I think it is important to set out the background to the budget, and it is itself reflected in the report. At point 10, our report says, in addition to a declining budget, the Scottish Government is also faced with considerable economic uncertainty as the European and UK economies struggle to recover from the 2008 financial crisis. Then it quotes the Cabinet Secretary from the 5th of November. The settlement that we received in UK spending review is the toughest since devolution over the 4-year period between 2010-11 and 2014-15. Our budget will be reduced by more than 11% in real terms, and within that, our capital budget will have been reduced by a third. The position in 2013 is particularly challenging, and I quote that to then refer to point 13. The committee recognises that continuing to meet its budgetary commitments in these circumstances remains a significant challenge for the Scottish Government. I welcome the cross-party recognition of that report because, frankly, Presiding Officer, it isn't always reflected in the debates we have in this chamber. I want to turn to the area of housing. I know that's an area of wide interest, and I refer to that part of the report that focus on housing. The Infrastructure Capital Investment Committee suggests that housing should be an area focused on, and indeed our committee at point 85 set out the committee believes that consideration is given to additional funding for affordable housing should additional funding become available. And just yesterday we saw an additional £50 million to be invested in affordable housing. I think that answers the point for Mr Rennie, who I see isn't here at this moment in time, Presiding Officer, that the money will be invested in affordable housing. I don't know if he thought there was going to be all invested in building some palatial mansion for some particular character. And before the Scottish Government has even formally responded to the Finance Committee, we already see that essentially the Scottish Government has responded to that request of the Finance Committee. And I think that is welcome. I also want to touch on the issue, because Kenny Gibson pointed this out, because there's still concern being expressed about the housing budget. I hear that again today. As Kenny Gibson pointed out in his intervention, Elaine Murray, in the final year of the Labour government, only 4,832 houses were completed, whereas in 2011-12, this SNP government built 6,882 houses. Perhaps that may be a ghost of budgets past for you, Mr McIntosh. I think that is a good record, but of course we should be looking to do more wherever we can. We should be looking to lever in more sources of funding, and through that part of the budget scrutiny process that I took part in when we visited Hoyt Eildon Housing Association, made the point that we should be innovative. We should try and utilise other sources of funding. They gave the example of pensions funds, and I know that John Swinney has responded to that suggestion positively, and the Government is looking at that general area. I also want to turn to the core purpose of the budget, supporting the Scottish economy. I want to set out some of the action that the Scottish Government has taken over the last few years that I particularly welcome. We have seen, we saw in February this year, an announced capital spending package of £380 million until 2015, focused on housing, transport, health, digital and maintenance projects. And of course, £700 million has been switched from resource to capital budget to support capital investment. We have seen a commitment to no compulsory redundancies in the public sector, a living wage for all workers covered by Scottish Government pay policy. We've also seen the council tax freeze for the 5th year in a row, the maintenance of free higher education, the abolition of prescription charges, and these are all responses to the economic circumstances of this time. They are helping families in difficult times, and of course we have a generous package of business reliefs, the most generous package of business reliefs in the UK, maintaining the Scottish High Street. So, going back to the point that is in the report, recognising the circumstances, the significant challenges that there are to the Scottish Government, I think the Scottish Government has a good record in that regard. In conclusion, though, President Officer, Ken Mackintosh, as I referred earlier, referred to ghosts of budgets past, present and future, and I think it was an interesting analogy, and I want to focus on the future, because if I remember correctly, the ghost of Christmas future was a portent of doom figure, and if we are to continue with the circumstances whereby the UK Government decides the size of Scotland's budget, then we may well reflect on just how right Mr Mackintosh was to talk of ghosts of budgets future more than he probably realised, because the only certainty if we vote no as a country in 2014 is more austerity. We saw in the autumn statement the Chancellor revising down his economic forecast once again from 0.8% predicting the UK budget to negative 0.1% this year. And we also see that Joe Stiglitz, David Blanchflower urging a different agenda, but the UK Government continues to prefer an austerity agenda and attacking the welfare system, and that is all harming the Scottish economy. So, like Ebenezer Scrooge, I hope that Ken Mackintosh can see the error of his ways by focusing on these ghosts of budget's future.
Thank you. Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Rob Gibson.
I actually would like to thank the Finance Committee for this excellent report, and I'm very pleased to be back on the committee, although not during the time they were compiling this report. Now, Mark MacDonald, in his speech, said that Labour speakers in the debate today were arguing for more money for everything, and I expect the Cabinet Secretary was looking to make a similar point in his wind-up speech. But if SNP members and others had listened to Labour speeches today, they would know that we were only concentrating on two particular areas in relation to extra spending, and those are colleges and housing. And I think that is absolutely the right choice, both for the sake of the individuals involved, for the sake of the economic growth in the wider economy, and also in order to address issues of social injustice and inequality. Now, I realise it is very difficult to realign revenue budgets, but I would ask the Cabinet Secretary over the course of the next 2 months, to concentrate on the resource budget for colleges in particular, and to reinstate that budget as far as possible. I won't give way at the moment. I'll give way later on if I've got time. We all know that Audit Scotland pointed out the 24% cut in college budgets between 11-12 and 14-15, and that translates into the 34 million cut, which is the focus of the current NUS campaign, which I support. So that, I believe, should be the focus of the Cabinet Secretary's attention in relation to resource budgets over the next 2 months. I hope that he can reinstate that as far as possible, not just for the individuals involved, 30% of whom are from deprived areas, but also in the interest of economic growth. And that was something that was also highlighted by the Education and Culture Committee. Now, it's the same combination of issues, I believe, in relation to housing, because, again, we need to address housing issues for the sake of individuals and the wider economy. And Kenneth Gibson reminded us that every £1 spent on construction translates into £5 for the wider economy. Again, it is hard, I realise, in current financial circumstances, but in a sense I think the Cabinet Secretary did have an opportunity because of the substantial amount of extra capital that he received from the UK Government, and I do believe that he didn't allocate enough to housing yesterday. Now, even after the 3 in-year additions to housing, I will do in a minute, the 3 in-year additions to housing that were announced over the last 12 months before yesterday, even after those, there was a 45% cut to the affordable housing budget over the course of the current spending review, compared to a 33% general capital cut. And that was actually the foundation of the report of the Infrastructure Committee, which was accepted by all members on it. I give way to somebody. Right.
Kenny Gibson. Thank you for giving way. I understand that Mr Chisholm believes in more money from the £205 million announced yesterday to be spent on affordable housing, but which of the projects that Mr Swinney announced, 93% of which should be completed within 15 months, should be cancelled in order to put more money into affordable housing?
Well, people will obviously make different choices in regard to that. I mean, I've tended to argue in previous budget rounds that housing should be the #1 priority for capital expenditure, and I've made my own views known on some other aspects, particularly of the road building budget. But people can make other choices. I'm just presenting the case for housing here, and I do think it is a pressing case. Now, the interesting point that I highlighted yesterday in my question to the Cabinet Secretary was that a year ago there were to be 6,000 affordable homes a year. After each of the 3 additions to housing budgets over the course of the last year, there were still to be 6,000 affordable homes each year. And as far as I can see, after the announcement yesterday of a further £50 million, we are still to have 6,000 affordable homes each year. Now, and the reason for that, I believe, is that we are really struggling to achieve that target of 6,000 affordable homes, 4,000 of which are supposed to be social rented. And of course, the evidence that we are struggling is that, in fact, in the year 2011-12, there were 3,000 social rented starts, and Elaine Murray highlighted that point. I give way to Jamie Hepburn.
Jamie Hepburn. I thank Malcolm Chisholm for being the first of 4 Labour members who tried to intervene on the giveaway, so I do thank him for that. It's very interesting because we're hearing this focus on the input, but I was interested to hear Mr Kelly. He was saying there's more focus on the output. By that measure, would Mr Chisholm not accept that more houses are being built now under the SNP than was the case under the Labour Party?
Malcolm Chisholm. I mean, that was a good point for Jamie Hepburn to intervene, because I just pointed out there were 3,000 social rented starts in 2011-12, and it's obviously the starts that are going to result in the completions in future years. The good figures for completions that the Scottish Government has had in 2011-12 was based on the much higher grant levels for housing association houses that pertained. And now we have the lower grant levels. We were told by housing association after housing association in the Infrastructure Committee, and I've had the same from housing associations in my constituency, that the £40,000 grant level is not sustainable, and that is the key reason why it is going to be so difficult to achieve the 6,000. And of course 6,000 itself is not adequate to meet the needs. So I do believe that the Cabinet Secretary does need to pay attention to the recommendation of the Infrastructure Committee that the 40,000 figure should be reviewed. Now, I've only got 40 seconds left. Obviously, I speak regularly about climate change, so I won't repeat what I said last week, but I would also refer to the Infrastructure Committee, with it, obviously its SNP majority, who said that there should be some change between the different transport lines, not asking for any extra money into transport, but some change between the transport lines in order to have more money for active travel. And I think that's very important, not just for climate change, obviously, but also as a fundamental plank of health improvement. So I hope the Cabinet Secretary will also look at that. But Labour, in conclusion, are being very focused in this budget debate, colleges and housing, and I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to do all he can in the next 2 months to find more money for them.
Many thanks. Now call on Rob Gibson to be followed by Jean Urquhart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we should look at the way in which we make budgets at the moment and see how they've changed over the years, and how, in fact, under the SNP government, that we've been working in a process of a national performance framework, which is something that didn't exist before. Therefore, it's partly something which has drawn attention by people who are critics in the report of the Finance Committee to say that it's, as we did in our committee at RACI, that we were unable to provide systematic evidence of linking funding options back to the outcomes in the NPF. Now, if you have this new way of doing it, it's going to take time to develop. We are beginning to get that kind of link-up, and therefore that's an improvement, and therefore we thank the Finance Committee for looking at these things in that fashion. You know, the Scottish Government needs to emphasise the consistency of references to the NPF, and therefore we are going to try and hold the Government to that. I hope that each committee will look at the areas in which the National Performance Framework refers, and it refers to all, and therefore use that as a measure about how we try to make progress here. Now, this is a theoretical matter, but it's becoming a practical matter to have a better assessment of what's actually going on in the whole of this. The Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee and Environment Committee, the RACI Committee, did take very seriously the fact that sustainable development was the focus of our deliberations. And the word sustainable in that development part is quite important. And I'm glad to see that there are pieces of evidence that show, for example, to reassure Malcolm Chisholm that cycling infrastructure is going to receive £3.9 million coming forward from the extra spending that we got from the autumn budget. Well, you know, every little helps. It would be nice to have 10% on all active travel, but indeed, individuals are going to have to be encouraged to take part in these things themselves, like walking. And, you know, how you encourage people to walk is one of the behavioural changes that we've got to try and bring to this whole process. So the budget can recognise that there can be spend by government, but there also has to be a response by people to be able to do these things that make the country healthier and travel more carefully. But there is one thing in the report which I feel very strongly about. I think across the Parliament, various committees have mentioned, and that is broadband. And I'm glad that Kenny Gibson, in his introduction to this, presiding officer, pointed out how the very high-speed broadband is excellent for downloading movies, but I haven't found it difficult to watch the iPlayer on 2 or 4 megabytes. If people in my constituency in the north of Scotland had 2 or 4 megabytes regularly, then they'd be able to do business, they'd be able to actually carry out the way of life which would allow them to be participating and improving in this sustainable economic development that we're so keen to have. Not the dash for high-speed broadband that is big news for people in the cities. That isn't good enough, and that's why I'm glad to see that HIE and other groups, following on with the help of European money, British money and Scottish Government money, will be pressing forward with the broadband case. But it's essential that we get in place, as early as possible, the systems that will work in the most out-of-the-way places, because there's no way that we can lay fibre to the most remote communities. And that's why improved broadband via satellite and so on, which is becoming a way forward, has got to be funded, because the BTs of this world and the other providers are only looking for a market. They see so few people, they won't provide to those areas, so we have to back that with public money. And if I want to see a priority, it's to see an increase in that area. The third part I would like to concentrate on from the RACI perspective is basically the consideration of the Climate Challenge Fund and areas around climate change. I'm delighted to have heard from the Environment Minister that our suggestion that the Climate Challenge Fund, which has been so successful for many kinds of communities, should have targets that allow the people who take up the Challenge Fund to then create a commercial activity beyond it. And that is a step forward, because the government has agreed to that, and I'm delighted that that part of the Finance Committee report has already been delivered. But looking at the whole issue of climate change and mainstreaming it, I'm not entirely happy with the fact that every committee has taken this seriously. We asked you last year in each committee who are making the reports to Finance to actually come up with means whereby you assess whether you're meeting the climate change obligations of the whole of the Climate Change Act. I'm sorry I don't have time. You may get a speech, you never know. In my case, from the RACI committee, we'd like to see that business mainstreamed in a good deal more detail, and indeed not consigned to paragraphs 192 or 194 to 198. It should be up front, and we look forward to that kind of change in the next budget process. We hope that the Cabinet Secretary can reassure us about the issues I've told the Parliament about in this particular late afternoon, end-of-term speech, but nevertheless the precursor to a budget which will take Scotland forward is attempting to try and measure things more accurately than before, and indeed is beginning to deliver for this country in a way that we can be proud of.
Thanks very much. Now Colin Jean Urquhart, to be followed by Mike Mackenzie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Finance Committee, I was pleased that the entire committee was able to agree on its report this year, as was not the case last year. As our budget from Westminster continues to shrink annually, so the Cabinet Secretary's job correspondingly gets that bit tougher. And it's vital that this whole chamber reflects the cross-party support at committee level for the government's efforts to do the best for Scotland. The committee took evidence from a range of witnesses, some of whom were supportive of the budget and some of whom raised concerns. And I'm glad that the committee took the full range of views on board and produced a balanced, thoughtful report that provides praise and constructive suggestions in equal measure in a manner which will hopefully aid the Cabinet Secretary in his efforts. Although I recognise this is a national budget, I would like to take some time in laying out what this budget means for the Highlands and Islands. The Cabinet Secretary has done, I believe, a good job in doing what he can with the limitations available to the Government. And I do think that it's becoming really intolerable when we talk about having control of our budget and the tax system, and to raise our own funds and to decide how best to invest, that other members in the other parties seem to think that that's a crazy idea, while it is actually the ability to do that that will ensure that we can see a difference and make a difference in the economy of this country. I would like to pick up on a couple of specific points. First, I'd like to welcome the £32.4 million for Highlands and Islands airports. That's the small airports in the region, and the help, the 10 regional airports, and as well as Dundee Airport. These small airports provide an essential service and provide jobs and an infrastructure which would otherwise be absent, and therefore contribute to economic growth.
I wonder if you'd like to raise your microphone a little. I can't hear you very well.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. The continuing regeneration of our island populations, as confirmed by the recent census results released this week, are undoubtedly due in part to this kind of support. The Scottish Government's funding of the Air Discount Scheme also ensures that these services remain affordable for most of our constituents. An important issue examined by my committee, as well as the Rural Affairs and Climate Change and Environment Committee and the Energy, Enterprise and Tourism Committee, was the government's stated commitment to deliver digital connectivity across the whole of Scotland by 2020. And we heard from the Scottish Chamber of Commerce, who correctly pointed out the frustrations in the Highlands and Islands at the lack of available fast and reliable broadband, which can inhibit economic development. So again, this investment, particularly in geographically remote areas, can be seen to be contributing to economic growth. It's vital that all of Scotland has reliable internet access. And I once again echo the committee's request for the government to examine prioritising this. In the time that I've left, Presiding Officer, I'd like to reflect on our approach to economic policy. There's been ample discussion in this chamber of the need for and concentration on economic growth, as if this on its own is a silver bullet for the tough times ordinary families face. But let us remember that during the early years of the new Labour government, economic growth also meant a growing gap between the richest and poorest in our society. And I do have to say that a number of evidence givers at our committee commented on the increase in the health budget as making the rest of the budget difficult for the Cabinet Secretary. But I would say that generally in other reports that have been taken that have not been about economic growth, health, good health, has been a priority for a lot of people. So I think we should recognise that investment. But we should begin to rebalance our ideas about what constitutes a strong economy and an economic approach that's based on the financial sector, where money begets money with no discernible communal benefit, seems neither strong nor sustainable to me. Although it is over a year old, I would recommend, as Patrick Harvey did in the budget debate last year, the Carnegie Trust report, More Than GDP, Measuring What Matters to the Chamber, for a far more thorough and eloquent case for such an approach. In closing, Presiding Officer, I commend this budget and look forward to seeing it help ordinary Scots in these tough times.
Many thanks. I now call on Mike Mackenzie to be followed by the closing speeches, Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to be able to speak in this debate, although I'm not a member of the committee, and I've had the benefit of reading the Finance Committee's comprehensive report, and I would like to commend the committee for their work in producing this. And the report quite correctly sets the context for the draft budget as one which is as challenging as any Scottish Finance Secretary has ever had to deal with. And it's challenging for two reasons. Firstly, because of the generally grim economic circumstances, and secondly, because of the cuts being imposed by the Westminster Government, amounting to a real-term cut of 11% over 4 years, and within that, a capital cut of almost 26%. Gavin Brown might like to pretend there's no such thing as inflation, but in reality that's just fantasy economics. And far from the Chancellor's promises of a much better outlook by now in the overall state of the economy. It's now much worse than when he took office. The prospect of a triple-dip recession looms large, unheard of, unprecedented, but it looms large now, and the UK faces the loss of its coveted AAA rating, and the fiscal position has worsened, not improved. And on its central aim of reducing the UK deficit, the austerity policy has just failed. But worse than that, it now appears as if it's locked us in to what's a downward spiral of economic misery. And the Chancellor has no answer. Certainly.
Gavin Brown.
Could Ember tell us how many countries in the entire world can borrow more cheaply than the UK?
Mike McKenzie.
I don't have these figures to hand. I think you're missing the point. We're possibly going to lose that. The UK is going to lose the AAA rating, and that's because of poor fiscal policy, poor economic policy. And the Chancellor has got no answer for this, except the promise of more austerity. But perhaps more disappointingly, the Labour Party, neither in Scotland nor in London, has any answer either, except perhaps from Joanne Lamont, with her own special brand of austerity to be unveiled at some point in the future by her Cuts Commission. And her claim that many of this Parliament's greatest achievements are unaffordable misses the fundamental point about the Scottish budget, about any Scottish budget, because by definition, it has to be balanced, and therefore current policies are affordable. If there is one aspect of this budget that might be genuinely held to be unaffordable, it's the £1 billion or so of PFI payments that have to be found on an annual basis. Buying infrastructure on a credit card was never affordable. This is perhaps the most unfortunate legacy in Scotland of the long years of the Labour and Lib Dem administration, and one which will take a very long time to forget. Sure.
McMahon.
PD is paid for in comparison to PFI.
Mike McKenzie.
I think the Q is in the term not-for-profit distribution. That's where the clue lies. But it's tempting, presiding officer, it's tempting to assume that this thread of economic illiteracy runs right through all of the opposition parties in this chamber. But in reading the committee report, I know this is not the case. The opposition members have got the same good grasp as economics as we all have. And this is why I think I see so very little of genuine criticism of the draft budget in the committee's report. They don't criticise it because, in fact, they accept that this is a good budget, a budget that strikes a careful balance between social policy and economic policy, between maintaining demand and confidence on one hand and providing the stimulus of capital investment on the other. It's a budget for both jobs and growth, maintaining jobs through a no compulsory redundancy policy and creating them and stimulating the economy through careful transfers from resource to capital. Presiding officer, there are two advisers that I always consult when I'm thinking about the budget. Advisers that have spoken to Scotland down through the centuries. Adam Smith defined our values of economic wisdom and prudence. Robert Burns articulated our social conscience. Together, they represent our shared cultural values, good economics and an egalitarian social conscience. Two sets of values that are not mutually exclusive, but in fact are mutually reinforcing. I would suggest that each would be happy with the Finance Secretary's budget and its careful compromise. So this is a good budget. It's a budget for jobs and for growth. But in the future, we'll see even better budgets. When Mr Swinney has the full range of fiscal levers, when Mr Swinney has full prudent borrowing powers, and when Scotland is independent.
Thank you very much. And in the spirit of Christmas and by special request, give Patrick Harvey 1 minute.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it will be enough time to make one simple point. I've been calling for the publication of a document called the Report on Policies and Proposals under the Climate Change Act. I called for the publication of it in advance of the introduction of the draft budget so that committees could undertake detailed and informed scrutiny to ask whether the budget fully funds the climate change policies the government is required to implement. This is not my request. It's required under the Climate Change Act to revise that RPP given the failure to meet the first target. The government hasn't published that in time for budget scrutiny, and I ask the Cabinet Secretary to give a simple, clear, cast-iron guarantee that he will publish that document so that we understand the government's climate change policies before he asks the Chamber to vote on the budget. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
And thank you. And we now move to the closing speeches. I call on Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As I stand to close, I have fresh in my mind the speech of Mike McKenzie, who I have to say tickled me rather towards the end of his speech when he said that the clue is in the name for NPD. He genuinely believes that there is no profit in the non-profit distribution model. Well, him and the other backbenchers are going to be devastated when they find out that it's capped profit instead of no profit. Although I have to say, up until now, it has been no profit, but that's basically because it's been no happening since it was first announced in December 2010. Yes, it takes a little bit longer than we realised, but it was announced in December 2010. It was re-announced in September 2011 when the figures were put in front of this Parliament, but something has happened over the course of that year to reduce it almost down to zero, to a mere 20 million in this financial year. The Cabinet Secretary says he's not disappointed by that. He stood up in the Chamber and said he's not disappointed because there's £900 million in procurement. Yet he told the Finance Committee that next year there will be £338 million spent on it. So there's 900 in procurement apparently, but there's only going to be £338 million spent in financial year 13-14. That's the first thing that the government, I think, has failed badly on when it comes to capital spending. But their other big-ticket item to win back Scotland's economy is the magical resource-to-capital plan. Over £700 million, apparently, over the course of the spending review, being shifted from resource to capital to create jobs. There are just a couple of flaws in this particular suggestion, though. One of them is that a big slice of the money comes from savings from the fourth crossing. So he's saving money from one capital project, putting it into others, but describing that somehow as a transfer from resource to capital, when of course it is simply capital to capital. The other flaw, of course, is in the enterprise agencies. The largest slice of transfer in the first 2 years was apparently going to come from the enterprise agencies. Over £200 million over this financial year and the next financial year combined, £200 million over 2 years, was going to be transferred by the enterprise agencies. But we hear recently that it's not £200 million at all. It's only going to be £99 million. We've lost £1 million of transfer from resource to capital over the course of a year. But at the same time, with the other hand, the Cabinet Secretary is demanding money for shovel-ready projects because there's lots of them within the enterprise agencies. Perhaps if they'd transferred the money from resource to capital that they said they were going to transfer, there wouldn't have been any need for the money for the shovel-ready projects within the enterprise agencies. The Deputy Presiding Officer, the central question the committee asked was, is this a budget for the economy? This was the yardstick by which the Scottish Government wanted to be judged. Indeed, Mr Swinney, a week before the budget was announced, I guarantee, he said, I will squeeze every penny out of the money we have available to us to boost the pace of recovery and to support the hard-pressed households of Scotland. Well, the central theme, as I say, of the Finance Committee's investigations were looking at whether or not it's a budget for the economy. Now, we did, I have to say, find evidence in favour of that proposition. There was an evidence session where evidence was presented or asserted that this was a strong budget for the economy. The only difficulty for the government is that all of that assertion came from one person, from the Cabinet Secretary himself, who said he believed it was a budget for the economy. It was difficult, I have to say, to find a single other organisation who genuinely believed that this was a budget for the economy. SCDI, in their written evidence, said it is difficult to discern a pattern of spending which aligns with successive Scottish executives or government's top priority of increasing sustainable economic growth. The CPPR, Centre for Public Policy and Regions, spending on the NHS budget has been favoured at the expense of others. While this meets an election pledge of passing on the UK Health Barnett consequentials, it is less clear how it helps secure faster economic growth. Or perhaps most damagingly of all for the Scottish Government, the Finance Committee's own budget advisor commented, "Given the relative changes in other budgets, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that maintaining current spending on health is currently the main priority of the Scottish budget." And indeed, as a committee, we were asked or encouraged to investigate the claims as to whether or not it was a budget for the economy. When you look at what is happening to colleges, for example, Deputy Presiding Officer, at a time of high youth unemployment, it's difficult to suggest that this is a budget for the economy. When you look at what is happening to housing, when the construction sector is on its knees, it's difficult to say it's a budget for the economy. When you look at the new taxes, whether it's the retail levy or the empty property taxes, it's difficult to see how that supports the economy. And when you're increasing the amount you expect to take in business rates by over £200 million a year, year on year, it's almost impossible to say that this is a budget for the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Rhoda Grant. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has indeed been an interesting debate, but I think the question remains, is this indeed a budget for jobs and growth? And I think the result of the debate is very clear that we're unable to tell, indeed, if that is, because the Government have not looked at the analysis that would provide us with that information. Many people talked about how the budget's presented, and it seems like year on year we talk about the need for level 4 figures. We need to see the outcomes of the budget, not just the inputs. And again, we talk about it, but we are no further forward. We need an analysis to tell us if indeed the budget is doing what it's doing, is supposed to be doing. The only evidence we see is what we read in the newspapers and what we see in our communities: poor economic growth and jobs falling. Therefore, we can only say that this doesn't look like a budget for jobs and growth. Other speakers have talked about how we measure this. Should we be looking at more than GDP to see growth, and should we indeed be looking at things like the Wellbeing Index? Very difficult to look even at the Government's own measures of outcomes in this budget, and I hope that that's something they'll take away and look at again so that we can measure it. Presiding Officer, we are very clear in the Labour Party that priorities need to be housing and college expenditure. Housing, because it not only provides homes, it provides jobs, and it also tackles fuel poverty and our carbon emissions. And colleges, because it provides education and skills, the skills we will need to provide those very things. Many speakers, Elaine Murray especially, talked about housing and its role as preventative spend. And SFHA also talked about this, talking about less hospitalisation in their submission on the budget report. But we also know that good housing also enhances people's educational outcomes, their attainment, and indeed affects crime and work as well. So if we're looking at preventative spend, housing is one of the main tenants for that.
On that basis, will you welcome then, because other members of your party don't seem to welcome, the fact that there were 2,050 more affordable houses completed last year than there were in the final year of your party's government?
Rhoda Grant.
I welcome any house that is completed. The trouble is with the government's policy, and I think this was a point Malcolm Chisholm made very eloquently in his speech. The government started this term in government with a promise in a manifesto that they were going to build 6,000 socially rented houses. Now we know per annum, we know that has now changed to affordable houses, and the definition of affordable houses changes on a daily basis. But what Malcolm very clearly said was, despite this additional funding that's levered in, the 50 million announced yesterday, that target hasn't changed. So we're seeing inputs, but we're not seeing outcomes. If this government was looking at outcomes, surely more funding into affordable housing would mean that that target grows. Indeed, it stays static and it changes, so we can, and in real terms actually falls, because we're not going to see the 6,000 socially rented houses that were promised in this government's manifesto. So no matter what they put in, we're not getting anything back out. So that is hugely disappointing, given the role that housing plays in our, not only for providing good housing, but as I said, it also provides jobs and apprenticeships. Some speakers, I think again Elaine Murray touched on HAG, and I think this is a real concern, especially in an area such as my own, if I can be parochial in the Highlands and Islands. Where the HAG grant falls, you can't build in rural areas because you don't have economies of scale. Elaine mentioned Aberdeenshire Housing Association, who had 1.4% of their normal housing was now being planned. This will have a devastating impact on those communities, and we need to do something now. We obviously welcome where you can get efficiencies, but if efficiencies are only giving you numbers, not houses where we need them, then that is a very poor performance indeed. Can I also talk about retrofits, because the housing budget can be spent on retrofits and making sure that not only the houses that we build are decarbonised, but the houses we already have. And fuel poverty is a huge issue, and certainly for my own committee was something we discussed. And I was disappointed that the SNP majority on the committee voted down a recommendation that at no less than £100 million be spent on fuel poverty by this government. And I would hope that the government would look at some of the housing funds for retrofits, not only lifting people out of fuel poverty, but also doing something about our climate change targets, like Rob Gibson mentioned, and indeed Patrick Harvey in his 1 minute made a very passionate plea for the RPP to be published. But all retrofits would have an impact on those climate targets. I'm very aware that my time is running out, Presiding Officer, but can I just touch on revenue to capital, because this was one of the issues that certainly came up for us in committee, and an awful lot of witnesses questioned whether indeed this was adding to jobs. We see that we've lost 51,700 jobs in the public sector. We've also lost 41,300 direct and indirect construction jobs. The revenue money going into capital is going somewhere other than Scottish construction. There is a real concern that there is leakage, and that is moving abroad, and that is impacting on our communities. Presiding Officer, I very much hope that the Government will take those points into account, and that they will use the powers they do have to provide economic growth and jobs in Scotland.
Many thanks. Now Colin John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary, 8 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, Mr Kelly reminded Parliament that somewhere along the line a distinguished parliamentary tradition was created, that this debate was the last debate before Parliament rises for the Christmas recess, and that certainly when I became the Finance Minister it became a source of great joy for me that this was the way in which I spent my last afternoon in Parliament before retreating to my constituency for the summer recess. Of course, used to be populated for the Christmas recess. It used to be populated, of course, by other great beasts that took part in this debate. Over there, for 4 years, David Whitten and Andy Kerr would speak for the Labour Party to conclude their to open and conclude their contributions to this debate, and on various occasions they would refer to me as Santa, Scrooge, Ebenezer, and I see that Mr Macintosh has decided to go down the same route. Can I just remind Mr Macintosh of what happened to Mr Kerr and Mr Whitten, who are no longer with us? and he may join the two ugly sisters at some stage in the future if he continues the same tiresome contribution to these debates. There have, of course, been very different contributions to the debate. My friends and colleagues Chick Brodie and Jean Urquhart set, I think, a very important tone for the debate, which was about very thoughtful, as did Mr Gibson, thoughtful contributions about the way the Finance Committee has tried to, I think, help Parliament in undertake some genuine parliamentary scrutiny, some dispassionate analysis of whether or not the Government is actually making progress in fulfilling the commitments that it makes to the people, and whether the financial propositions for which I am responsible are supporting the Government in its wider agenda. At the other end of the spectrum, without a doubt, the award for the most miserable contribution to the debate would go to James Kelly, who managed to go through 6 minutes of undiluted miserablism about the budget. He managed to talk about the lack of focus on outcomes in the Finance Committee report, and at no stage mentioned the National Performance Framework that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year for members to assess whether the Government is making progress on achieving outcomes. Nor did he manage to mention the carbon assessment that the Government publishes with the budget in terms of the analysis of carbon reduction. He managed to mention the Audit Scotland report, which was very critical of health inequalities, but he managed not to mention the 40% decline in deaths from heart and stroke disease in our country, which is not just the responsibility of this Government, but which our predecessors contributed significantly. Where was the balanced contribution that Jean Urquhart or Chick Brodie appealed for in the contribution that Mr Kelly made to the debate today? So if anyone wishes to do some Christmas reading about how to deliver a miserable speech to Parliament, I suggest they look at Mr Kelly's, and it will suffice as a guide in every respect. Now, on capital, we've had a pretty substantive discussion about the issues and about the timing of NPD projects. And I think Parliament is familiar with the fact that the Government gives estimates of its projected plan on some of these projects. Some encounter difficulties. The Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route clearly is a project that's had great difficulty. The Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital, we've had to resolve some very significant issues about land access with the private consortium that run the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, which are now happily resolved. And I have told Parliament that £900 million of NPD work is currently in procurement and will, of course, be undertaken and deployed. Now, there's been some commentary about whether or not the capital programme has delivered enough work to the construction sector, and I'd be the first to admit that construction has had a very difficult time over the last few years. But let me just share with Parliament a quote from Ken Gillespie, the Managing Director of Morrison's Construction, the 19th of September 2012, and I'll quote Mr Gillespie in full. "Construction feels that we have a stronger market in Scotland than we have elsewhere in the UK. The Scottish Government identified very early in this recessionary period the benefits of infrastructure investment to the economy. Unlike central government, they got on and did it. We are seeing a pipeline of projects coming to market which will support economic recovery in Scotland. The Scottish Government's procurement agency, the Scottish Futures Trust, are adopting a far more sophisticated approach to public sector procurement." Now, I simply leave those words with Parliament to reflect on in the spirit that my colleagues were asking of dispassionate evidence from observers that colleagues might want to reflect upon. Now, of course I will, yes.
I'm grateful to him for giving me. How does he square that comment off, though, from one business versus the comments made by the Scottish Building Federation, who, of course, represent most of the industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm always interested in the comments that lobbying organisations have to make in all these debates, but there's somebody who actually goes out and creates jobs and delivers contracts that I've just read out, Mr Ken Gillespie of Morrison Construction. Now, on the question of housing expenditure, which have been substantive contributions from Elaine Murray and Malcolm Chisholm to the debate, I simply make the point, as I've made on numerous occasions, that the ability to deliver the outcomes we want to achieve on housing cannot only be delivered or determined by whether we provide the same amount of money that's been provided in the past. There is a question of efficiency and value, and at a time of financial constraint, Parliament would expect me to be trying to deliver efficiency and value in the housing programme. Of course, I have put in an extra £200 million into the budget in the course of this year, and the Government will look to strengthen housing expenditure where we possibly can do. I'll give way briefly to
Elaine Murray.
I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary accepts the evidence, however, from the housing associations that the level of subsidy they receive at the moment makes it very, very difficult for them to be able to borrow and to construct houses to be able to let them at an affordable rent.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't accept that evidence because what I believe is on other occasions when we've heard about pressure on the level of housing association grant and been told that we can't deliver the outcomes that were achieved, we have been able to go on to do that. But the Government, of course, will continue to engage in dialogue with housing associations on this one. If Mr Chisholm will forgive me, I have to conclude my remarks. Ultimately, and I apologise to Mr Chisholm because I'm about to mention him into the bargain and I can't take an intervention, but ultimately this all comes down to choices. I accept that. I accept that entirely. I've made my choices and I've set them out in the budget. It's now up to other people to make their choices. Now, Mr Chisholm said in his contribution that Labour were very focused on housing and college places. He then went on to ask for more money for active travel and went on, and Ken McIntosh asked for more money for the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme on rail, and nobody has graced this great Christmas debate with an idea of where the money is coming from. Mr Brown, to his credit, said that he didn't like empty property relief or business rates, and he thought the health budget was too high. So that is an interesting point coming from Mr Brown, that the Conservatives are now supporting reductions in health expenditure to put, I'm sorry, I listened. Mr Brown raised concern about the level of the health budget and then said that empty property relief was coming and business rates and all the rest of it. So I can assume the Conservative Party must now be the health cutters, and we will just hear what they say. But the serious point, Presiding Officer, that I make is that this is a budget that is put before Parliament, and the test of all parties is whether they can offer constructive contributions about how money can be redeployed. Let's hear them. Let's hear them from the other parties, because we've never heard them from the Labour Party, we've never heard them from the Conservative Party, and we look forward to hearing from them. We're all ears for the proposals of the opposition.
Many thanks. I now call on John Mason to wind up the debate at 9.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I must congratulate you on giving me my full time this year, because I think last year I got a bit curtailed by somebody. Presiding Officer, in closing this debate on behalf of the committee, can I first of all thank the Cabinet Secretary for his assurances that the report will be responded to in detail, and we look forward to having all of that. I'd like to speak on 3 topics to start with, then comment on some of the statements that have been made through the debate, and finally wind up with some comments about the report. Firstly, one area that we looked at on the committee was skills and employment. As the convener said, the committee has undertaken a separate inquiry into improving employability, and that report has recently been published, and we hope to debate that, I believe, in the very next debate coming up in this chamber. Some issues arose which affected both the inquiry and the budget scrutiny, and I want to focus today on the points which emerged during the draft budget examination. One of the points which was highlighted in the draft budget report was that made by Professor Jeremy Peat during a roundtable discussion with the David Hume Institute, when he spoke about making the best use of people and developing people with the right skills. A few points on this theme of human capital I want to draw attention to. For example, in that session from the David Hume Institute, Professor Donald McRae of Lloyds Banking Group said, "I do not believe that the explanation of our low economic performance is a low level of human skills or human capital." And a similar point was made by Stephen Boyle of RBS, who said not only is the quality of Scotland's human capital strong, indeed is one of our genuine sources of economic potential, but it is particularly strong at the higher education level. However, he did go on to say the human capital challenge emerges not with more high-skilled people, but with those who do jobs requiring lower levels of skills and qualifications. If I wanted to worry about something in the human capital sphere in Scotland, it would be that. We look forward to debating further on this and other issues around the employability theme. Secondly, on the point of picking winners, which has already been commented on by one or two speakers, I think, including Stuart Stevenson this afternoon, I would refer to the evidence session we had with Professor Kay, who set out his view in his written evidence that, quote, "The appropriate industrial strategy for Scotland is that it should be based on the principle that small countries succeed in the world economy by exporting narrow specialisations on a global scale." He suggests that this means picking winners by identifying and promoting sectors in which Scotland has genuine competitive advantage, and that the emphasis should be on sectors that are winners, not on ones that we would like to be winners. I must say I did think his contribution was very thought-provoking, although clearly not everybody agreed with it. For example, a contrasting view to this was discussed at a roundtable session with the David Hume Institute, which the convener in his opening speech talked about that evidence, where we heard on the access to capital and mentioned the point made to us about companies reaching a point at which significant capital is required and when they may then move the business into another model, for example, through being acquired. Professor Colin Mason of the Adam Smith Business School said, "The challenge is therefore not just to create more high-growth firms, but to keep them owned and managed in Scotland. How do we do that? We cannot simply pick winners. We cannot predict in advance where high-growth firms will come from, either at the firm level or the sectoral level. A lot of companies that we interviewed said that the support at the early stages is critical. We need, therefore, a package of early support that is relevant to potentially high-growth firms. That means things like equity finance, export assistance and management training." Professor Kay considered that contribution which whisky makes to the Scottish economy is significantly overestimated. I think that was quite a controversial point, and he was quite disappointed. He argued that the growth of the Scotch whisky industry is not that impressive, given the extent of global growth in spirit consumptions. There are a lot of questions that we should be asking about the whisky industry and its contribution to Scotland. More generally, in relation to the food and drink industry, Professor Kay states that he is not sure that Scotland's potential as having a premium brand in food and drink is being realised. While it was not a session as part of our draft budget scrutiny, whisky sector did feature in our evidence session with Scottish Enterprise earlier this year, when the Chief Executive said, "The burgeoning middle class in Brazil offers huge opportunities for Scottish consumer goods. For example, one of the fastest growing markets for whisky is Brazil." Given the points made in evidence to the committee, we have invited the Scottish Government to respond to the views of Professor Kay regarding its role in the development of skills and capabilities in areas where Scotland has a genuine competitive advantage, and how best to realise Scotland's potential as having a premium brand in food and drink. The third area, which has also been mentioned on pages 23 and 24 of the report, is the non-domestic rates income NDRI. The committee notes the evidence of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce and comments it made about NDRI. They said their members are acutely aware that they feel, or they are essentially paying a larger share towards the overall spend in the Scottish budget, and I note that Gavin Brown touched on that latterly as well. It went on to say, "We believe that we cannot only go so far before it becomes unsustainable. It cannot go on forever. We must look for a more equitable way of allocating finance to ensure that non-domestic rates play a proportionate role." However, I think the other side to that is that the committee is aware that control over taxes is severely limited at the moment, and if a company does make profits, we are unable to benefit through corporation tax. The committee notes the concern of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee about any potential shortfall in non-domestic rate income and the impact this could have, and the Finance Committee has asked the Scottish Government for more regular reports on collection performance. Presiding Officer, I'd like to move on to just a few comments on issues that were raised during the debate, and clearly this afternoon one of the key issues was housing. I think a number of people have said if more money is to be put into housing, where is it to come from? And in particular, Ken McIntosh, when I intervened on him, did not give me an answer on that. Elaine Murray talked about the £40,000 level of HAG and whether that was sustainable, but I think she forgot to mention that one of the issues is that there have been free reserves in housing associations, and while that cannot be continued year after year, a number of housing associations, for example Parkhead in my own constituency, have used their free reserves to continue their development programme, even though, of course, everybody accepts that that cannot go on forever. Willie Rennie and others mentioned preventative spending and the evidence that £1... yes, absolutely. Okay.
Elaine Murray.
I thank John Mason for taking the intervention. Isn't that the very point? That the housing associations have now used up their reserves and therefore they don't have the capability of drawing on that money any longer?
John Mason.
Well, I think there's some evidence that some housing associations may have used up the reserves. Some from stock transfer never had any. But there are others which still do have reserves, and I'm sure that's something we'll get a response from in due course from the government. I think what I was going to say from Willie Rennie's point about preventative spending, and others have mentioned that as well, is that £1 can maybe save £5 here, £7 there, £9 somewhere else. We're not now choosing between what preventative spending and other spending. We're having to choose between different forms of preventative spending and deciding where the money is best to come from. The problem is choosing, and the problem is where to disinvest. To move on to a few comments on the report itself, I must say I think the report strikes a good balance. It's neither unduly critical of the government, nor does it blindly praise the government for all it does. And if you look at the final paragraph of paragraph 226, the final sentence, I think it makes that clear. The report did not need any amendment, and I think Malcolm Chisholm said it was an excellent report. However, there was a critical motion put forward at the committee, and I felt duty-bound to put forward a balancing one myself, praising the government. However, the reality was neither amendment was actually necessary, and I think it was good that both amendments were defeated, and I think that Jean Urquhart got it right by voting against both amendments. It is important that the committee system in this Parliament works well, and there is a danger that MSPs in party of government blindly support the government, and a danger that opposition MSPs blindly oppose the government. Each of us faces the individual challenge of balancing our duties to party and to Parliament as a whole, and I believe the Finance Committee has had some success in doing that. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, there are a number of crucial issues which the committee has raised and which we hope the Scottish Government will respond to. The committee will seek to continue its scrutiny of these issues through its draft budget examination next year and through other aspects of our work programme, such as the work on improving employability, demographic change and the ageing population, and our scrutiny of the tax powers under the Scotland Act. These powers have the potential to put much more teeth into future budgets. I support the motion in the name of the convener.
Thank you. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion number 5203 in the name of Kenneth Gibson on the Finance Committee's report on the draft budget 2013-14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. May I take this opportunity to wish you all a happy Christmas and a good New Year, and hope that you can enjoy some time with your friends and family. I now close this meeting.